Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the gilded cages of Europe's youngest queens, girls who wore crowns before they even learned what heartbreak felt like. You'll follow them through candlelit corridors, through velvet halls that echoed with expectations, and through the kind of loneliness that no coronation could ever cure. The irony, of course, is that the higher the crown, the lonelier the view from underneath it. You probably wouldn't survive 1 week in their shoes, not because of the politics, but because of the silence. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing the little constellation of listeners glowing across the map. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You can almost hear the hush of court corridors before dawn, servants padding across polished floors, curtains drawn to keep the chill out. Somewhere, in a cradle shaped like a throne, a baby already belongs to history. She's not playing with dolls, she is the doll, porcelain, perfect, and possessed by a nation. You imagine tiny fingers gripping a rattle as bishops murmur blessings she can't yet understand. Europe has never been short on crowns, but it has a tragic fondness for giving them to little girls. Infant queens, teenage monarchs, and young brides sent to foreign thrones, all pawns in the grand chessboard of diplomacy. And through them runs the same quiet thread, the strange ache of being seen by everyone but known by no one. Somewhere in a Spanish nursery, a nurse hushes a wailing child who will grow up to be Isabella. She's barely old enough to toddle when courtiers begin measuring her smile for state portraits. Her mother, Maria Cristina, rules as regent, stern, beautiful, terrified of losing control. The child's crown is mostly metaphorical for now, but its weight is real enough, gold made of expectation. And then there's little Victoria across the channel, another baby with destiny scribbled on her birth certificate. Her father dies when she's still in diapers, leaving her mother and a strict German governess to shape her into something more statue than child. No friends, few outings and diaries locked away like secrets. Historians still argue whether that isolation forged her strength or broke something she could never quite repair. Even earlier, go back centuries, and you find Mary, Queen of Scots, crowned before she could talk. Imagine the candles taller than her, the Latin prayers bouncing off the cathedral walls while she's too busy chewing her own fingers. The adults call it divine right. The child calls it nap time. There's a pattern here, one that never gets less tragic. The state needs a symbol, and symbols don't get to be children. The moment a little girl inherits a throne, she loses her name and gains a nation. Her laughter becomes a public property, her tears a political liability. You picture a hall full of men in powdered wigs debating alliances while a 10-year-old sits on a dais, legs swinging above the floor. Every movement is analyzed, how she bows, how she blinks, how she hesitates before signing a paper she doesn't understand. Somewhere, an ambassador writes to his king that the young queen shows promise. What he really means is she hasn't disobeyed yet. Meanwhile, behind the tapestry, her governess reminds her to sit straighter. A maid combs her hair until it hurts, and the child, God help her, starts learning to smile without meaning it. There's something chilling about the way power gets dressed up as privilege. These girls grow up in silk sheets, yes, but they also grow up knowing that their futures are not their own. A wrong alliance could collapse an empire. A single flirtatious glance could become treasonous gossip. Even the dresses they wear are stitched with politics. colours chosen to flatter certain ambassadors, fabrics imported to please certain allies. And you, the listener, feel the absurdity of it all, the way grown men build empires on the shoulders of girls who just wanted to go horseback riding. One of the quirkiest details about these child queens is how much of their early education revolved around the idea of divine decorum. For instance, Isabella II of Spain was taught to cross herself between bites of food, so dinner took about 3 hours. Victoria was forbidden to walk downstairs without permission, lest her independence get ideas. And poor Mary Stuart, before the age of 10, could recite more Latin prayers than nursery rhymes. Historians still argue whether that kind of pious micromanagement was meant to instill humility or just ensure obedience. Either way, it left its mark. You imagine the bedtime routines, lullabies replaced by Latin psalms, nannies whispering about political assassinations like fairy tales gone wrong. Instead of dreams, they inherit agendas. Instead of lullabies, letters of alliance, and yet there's something hauntingly human about them. For all the formality, they scribbled doodles in their margins, wrote shy notes to friends, fell for unsuitable men, and tried, quietly, to find pieces of themselves in gilded cages. That's the paradox of Europe's youngest queens, adored by millions, trusted by none. Every smile rehearsed, every word watched, every heartbeat echoing inside a palace too big for a child. You feel it, the loneliness stitched into the silk, the ghostly weight of expectation hanging in the air like incense. If power isolates, then early power is a kind of exile. And so tonight's story begins not with war or rebellion, but with a lullaby that never ends. You're walking through centuries of marble corridors where small footsteps once echoed, queens in training, queens in mourning, queens in name only. One crown at a time, we'll find them again. Isabella's trembling smile, Victoria's ink-stained fingers, Mary's stitched prayers, all those young hearts hidden behind veils, vows and velvet. And for a moment you might wonder whether you'd trade your freedom for their jewels. Then again, you probably wouldn't survive one dinner at court without crying in the bathroom. Spain, 1833. The heat settles like a blanket over Madrid, and in the palace nursery, a 2-year-old girl has just become a queen. You picture her, Isabella, tiny hands gripping the edge of her crib, her curls sticking to her forehead as the air smells faintly of candle wax and old velvet. Her father, King Ferdinand VII, lies cold in another room. Her mother, Maria Cristina, already wears black and a frown that could cut glass. You might expect trumpets or parades, but coronations for toddlers aren't exactly festive. The ministers whisper, the generals posture, and Maria Cristina begins the balancing act of a lifetime, ruling in her daughter's name while keeping her brother-in-law from stealing the throne. It's a political dance that would exhaust a seasoned monarch, let alone a child who can barely speak in full sentences. And so begins the strange life of Spain's porcelain doll queen. By age 6, Isabella can curtsy perfectly. By age 10, she can tell which courtiers despise her without them saying a word. You can imagine her at breakfast, sipping chocolate from a porcelain cup, feet dangling, listening to cabinet debates through the keyhole of her mother's study. Her tutors tell her she's God's chosen vessel. That's a lot to dump on a girl who still believes in fairy tales. But the Spanish court doesn't do fairy tales. It does conspiracies, coups, and confession booths. Historians still argue whether Maria Cristina truly loved her daughter or simply loved power through her. What's certain is that Isabella grew up in a house divided by whispers. Her mother's secret second marriage, yes, she married a guardsman in private, scandal of the decade, created rifts that made the palace feel like a chessboard. Every move mattered. Every ally could turn traitor overnight. You sit with Isabella at her desk as she practices her signature, the loops growing bolder each year. There's something both innocent and ominous about it. The handwriting of a queen in progress. Outside, Spain convulses, civil war. The Carlists, those loyal to Isabella's uncle, Don Carlos, declare her illegitimate. Armies march under banners proclaiming divine male succession. But inside the palace, little Isabella is still memorizing catechisms, blissfully unaware that half her country would rather see her dethroned. There's a kind of dark humor to it. The idea that a nation's fate depends on the bedtime routine of a child. Did she brush her hair? Did she say her prayers? Excellent. Then the Bourbon dynasty survives another day. As she grows, the palace becomes both cradle and cage. Her daily schedule could make a general weep. Lessons in religion, dancing, embroidery, and queenly comportment. Her governess hovers with a rosary in one hand and a ruler in the other. Even laughter is corrected. Too loud, too unladylike, too real. Every so often, though, Isabella sneaks a moment of rebellion. A prank on a servant, a skipped lesson, a whispered giggle with her sister, Louisa. Small cracks in the porcelain. You smile because it's the only freedom she'll ever really know. One fringe detail historians love to mention: Isabella's first pet was a caged canary named Libertad, freedom. You couldn't invent symbolism that neat if you tried. By adolescence, the young queen's face begins appearing on coins. Imagine seeing your own profile next to phrases like De gratia, by the grace of God, a teenage girl immortalized in silver while still sneaking chocolates from the kitchen. But the court doesn't see a teenager, it sees a bargaining chip. And soon the whispers of marriage begin. Who will get the Spanish throne by marrying the girl who barely knows her own reflection? The French push for one of their princes. The English hint at alliances. The Spanish nobles demand something pure and local. The debates grow vicious. The portraits of eligible cousins arrive by carriage, and somewhere in the middle of it, Isabella loses the last fragments of childhood. Maria Cristina, ever the strategist, arranges a match that shocks even the gossips. Isabella will marry her double cousin, Francisco de Assis. Yes, double cousin. Genetic size in the corner. Francisco is delicate, shy, rumoured to have more interest in silk waistcoats than politics or women. Historians still argue whether the marriage was consummated at all. One courtier quipped that their wedding night required 3 candles and 2 rosaries. When the morning came, the nation sighed. Spain had a king consort, and Isabella had a roommate with royal titles. You picture her in her chamber the next day, staring at her reflection. 17, married, and more alone than she's ever been. The courtiers bow. The church blesses. And yet, somewhere behind her eyes, you can feel the echo of a child still looking for a canary named Libertad. The palace walls seem closer now, thicker. The marble gleams, but the air feels stale. Every smile is diplomacy, every gesture, theatre. When she walks through the throne room, the courtiers lower their eyes, not out of respect, but calculation. And in those corridors, a strange strength begins to harden inside her. The kind born not from confidence, but from constant surveillance. You learn to survive by performing. A court rumour claims Isabella could sense betrayal before it happened. Another insists she used to sneak into the chapel at night, barefoot, and talk to God, not pray, just talk, like a lonely girl to an invisible friend. It's an image that lingers, a teenage queen whispering confessions to an empty altar, while her mother plots alliances in another room. You lean back, imagining the glow of candles against her pale face, the smell of wax and lilac perfume. Outside, thunder rolls over Madrid, the same city that will one day cheer for her downfall. But that's still years away. For now, she's still young, still hopeful, still telling herself that maybe, just maybe, being queen will feel less lonely once she's older. Spoiler, it won't. The palace in Madrid has many rooms, but only one feels alive, the nursery Isabella left behind. The rest of the building is a museum of decorum, portraits that stare too long, chandeliers that never stop glittering, and silence thick enough to taste. You can almost hear her heels clicking through the marble corridors as she grows from a frightened teenager into a woman surrounded by ghosts. Her father's absence hangs in every tapestry. Ferdinand VII, stern, pious, unpredictable, died before she could remember his face. Yet his legend stalks her. Ministers mention him in every decision, courtiers invoke him when advising her, and priests remind her that she must honor his moral vision. Imagine being haunted not by a person, but by an idea, one that disapproves of everything you do. Even her mother's presence feels spectral now. Maria Cristina is still alive, yes, but more regent than mother, more political compass than comfort. They eat breakfast together under gilded ceilings, never quite making eye contact. Isabella's spoon scrapes her plate like a metronome for tension. "Smile," her mother whispers before court sessions, as if that single word could mend the cracks between them. But Isabella knows better. Her mother's power is waning, and every noble at court can smell it. Spain's politics are shifting like sand. Liberals demand reform, conservatives demand control, and the church demands obedience. The Queen, barely out of adolescence, stands in the middle, a porcelain figurine balancing a nation on her head. You picture her on the balcony, sunlight hitting her jewels as the crowd roars below. Thousands cheer, yet she feels like a mannequin on display. Somewhere in that sea of faces, a protester mutters, "Down with the child queen." She hears it and keeps smiling. Historians still argue whether Isabella's infamous emotional volatility came from youth, stress, or the simple fact that everyone around her was lying. Her cousin husband, Francisco, provides no solace. Their marriage, arranged as a peace treaty disguised as romance, dissolves into polite distance. He keeps his quarters, she keeps hers. Their dinners are silent, their public outings rehearsed. Occasionally, they exchange notes, short, careful, and painfully formal. One of them begins with, "Your Majesty, I request permission to dine privately this evening." Imagine asking your spouse for permission not to eat together. And yet there are moments, small, rebellious moments, when Isabella remembers she is still human. One summer night, she sneaks into the palace gardens without her guards. The moonlight catches the lace of her dress, the air smells of jasmine, and for a brief second she forgets that half of Spain despises her. She dips her hand in the fountain's cool water, traces ripples across its surface, and whispers, "Just for tonight, I'm no one." A gardener spots her, bows too deeply, and ruins the illusion. You chuckle softly. Royal solitude never lasts. That same year, Isabella begins taking an interest in the art of politics, or at least in surviving it. She listens during council meetings, takes notes in looping handwriting, and occasionally interrupts a minister mid-sentence, much to their horror. "I may be young," she tells them, "but I am not deaf." It's a small victory, one that earns her a reputation for being emotional, which in 19th century Spain is code for a woman who dares to speak. Still, the loneliness persists. Her mother withdraws further into manipulation, her husband into indifference. So Isabella turns her attention elsewhere, to companionship, to friendship, and eventually to the kind of affection forbidden by decorum. Her court becomes infamous for its flirtations and whispered rumours. Letters from foreign ambassadors describe a palace of passions. The French, of course, are scandalized but intrigued. The British roll their eyes. The Spanish clergy begin drafting sermons about moral decay. Historians still argue whether Isabella's affairs were acts of rebellion or desperation. Either way, they gave her something that politics never could, control, even if fleeting. You imagine her leaning out of her carriage window, the Madrid streets alive with gossip. Men tip their hats, women whisper, and somewhere in that noise she finds a twisted kind of freedom, the validation of being seen, even if wrongly. There's an odd tenderness in that image. A lonely young queen trying to feel alive by any means necessary, yet her reign is far from romantic. The country is fracturing beneath her. Revolts flare like fever. Ministers come and go faster than seasons. The church hovers like a watchful parent, and the army grows restless. One day, Isabella walks into her study to find her advisers arguing over her portrait. Literally. Should she be depicted as a saintly mother or a powerful monarch? She stares at both drafts and mutters, "Neither looks like me." You can almost see it, the exhaustion in her eyes, the small tremor in her fingers as she signs yet another decree she doesn't believe in. Behind the scenes, her mother still writes letters to the Pope, begging him to support Isabella's legitimacy. Her husband, meanwhile, collects art and titles and avoids conversation. And Isabella, now fully queen, fully trapped, sits by the window each night, counting the church bells until dawn. Here's a quirky tidbit. She insisted that the royal palace install a secret passage leading from her chambers to the chapel. Not for piety, though she claimed it was, but for escape. It said she'd slip away during tense evenings, kneel before the altar, and whisper half prayers, half confessions into the dark. One attendant claimed she once murmured, "Everyone kneels to me, but no one listens." And there it is, the truth of her ghostly cage, the marble floors, the jewels, the titles. They're all camouflage for a girl still searching for connection. Spain may have called her Isabella the Desired, but desire in her world was always political. From the outside, her reign sparkles. Inside, it's suffocating. And so you walk beside her down those endless corridors again, the same polished ones she first toddled through as a child. The portraits glare, the candles drip, the air smells faintly of dust and despair. She pauses before a mirror, traces the edge of her crown, and sighs. Somewhere behind her, a clock ticks louder than usual, marking the slow passage of another sleepless royal night. And if you listen closely, beneath the hush of brocade and duty, you can almost hear her whisper it again. Soft, barely audible. Libertad. The morning of Isabella's wedding smells like lilies and cold dread. You picture her standing in front of an enormous mirror, white lace heavy as armor, her corset laced too tightly to breathe. The air in the royal chapel is thick with incense and politics. The organ begins to roar. Every face in the pews watches her as though she's a symbol rather than a girl. And in truth, she is. Her cousin, Francisco de Assis, waits at the altar. He's delicate, his hands gloved, his moustache trimmed into the kind of perfection that suggests too much time with the mirror. He smiles, but the smile doesn't reach his eyes. Somewhere behind them, the French ambassador mutters that the whole thing feels like a farce. The British envoy scribbles notes about a union destined for trouble. You, meanwhile, are just trying not to laugh when you learn that both bride and groom share all 4 grandparents. Royal bloodlines, as it turns out, are less noble lineage and more genetic speedrun. The vows are spoken, the rings exchanged, and Isabella's fate is sealed. When the priest declares them man and wife, a murmur ripples through the crowd, not of joy, but of calculation. Everyone here knows this marriage isn't built on love. It's built on strategy, fear, and a desperate attempt to keep the Spanish crown within its trembling borders. Later that night, the young queen sits at the edge of her bed, the scent of candle smoke clinging to her gown. Francisco sits in a chair across the room, still in full uniform, reading a devotional book. Between them stretches the silence of an entire country. Historians still argue whether the marriage was consummated that night or ever. One account claims Francisco insisted on sleeping with gloves. Another says Isabella dismissed her maids, sighed and muttered, "God has a sense of humour." Either way, the fairy tale never begins. Instead, what unfolds is a slow-motion tragedy played out across the balconies of Madrid. Publicly, the royal couple appears united. Privately, they orbit each other like distant moons. Isabella fills her court with laughter, music, and flirtation. Francisco retreats into prayer and embroidery. Rumour becomes their only conversation. And Spain eats rumour for breakfast. The salons buzz, the newspapers wink. One writer describes the Queen as vibrant, impulsive, and surrounded by admirers. Another calls her the Bourbon Venus. You can almost hear the smirk in their ink. The palace becomes a stage for gossip. Courtiers exchange glances behind fans. Priests scowl, but attend her soirees anyway. A British envoy writes home, "The Queen is young, beautiful, and alarmingly fond of freedom." Translation, she's not following the script, but can you blame her? She grew up in confinement, raised by politics instead of parents, married off to a man chosen by ministers. Now, with power finally in her hands, she tastes defiance like sugar on her tongue. Still, the loneliness persists, haunting even her laughter. You see her late one night, pacing through the long marble hallways in a silk dressing gown, barefoot, her crown left on a table somewhere behind her. A storm rages outside, rain tapping the windows like impatient fingers. She stops at a mirror, the same mirror that once reflected her as a child, and studies her own face. "How do I look like a queen?" she whispers, "when I feel like a ghost?" The next day, she throws a ball. Candles blaze from 1,000 sconces. The musicians play waltzes imported from Vienna. The air is heavy with perfume and rumour. Isabella dances with everyone except her husband. Ministers smile through clenched teeth. Her mother, watching from a balcony, whispers to a confidant. She's making herself enemies, faster than I can count them. But the young queen doesn't care. For a few hours, under the shimmer of chandeliers, she's just a woman who wants to move, to feel her body obey, something other than politics. A quirky little detail survives from that night. One of her slippers broke mid-dance, and she laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. A servant hid the broken heel as a keepsake, convinced it was an omen of freedom. Freedom, of course, has its price. Within a year, pamphlets begin circulating, anonymous, venomous, gleeful. They accuse her of affairs, of corruption, of favoritism. Some even question the paternity of her children before she's had any. The public turns her private life into national theatre. Historians still debate whether these pamphlets were orchestrated by political rivals or moral crusaders. It hardly matters to Isabella. What matters is the realization that no one, neither church, nor court, nor husband, stands beside her. And so she fights back the only way she knows how, by ruling. Her ministers underestimate her. They expect the girl queen to nod prettily while they steer the ship. Instead, she replaces them one by one, often mid-meeting. One diplomat calls her a tempest in lace. She wears the insult like jewellery. She even develops her own strange sense of humor. Once, after dismissing a particularly pompous advisor, she quips, "If I must be surrounded by fools, they should at least make me laugh." You can't help but like her a little. And yet her power isolates her further. The church condemns her moral looseness. The military grows restless. The liberals turn revolutionary again. Francisco sulks in the background, occasionally praying louder than necessary, as though holiness were a competition. By her mid-20s, Isabella has everything she was promised: crown, palace, children, control, and nothing she wanted. The candle-lit dinners feel colder now, the corridors longer. Even her laughter starts to sound rehearsed again, but she endures. The same stubborn streak that once made her defy her tutors now keeps her throne upright. You can almost admire it, the fierce refusal to collapse under the weight of expectation. Still, late at night, she returns to that secret passage between her chamber and the chapel. You follow her in imagination, barefoot, a silk train brushing the stone steps, the faint scent of incense from a dozen forgotten prayers. She kneels before the altar and stares at the crucifix. Her voice trembles. "Everyone wants me to be their queen," she murmurs. "No one wants me to be myself." The candles flicker, the air shifts. Outside, the bells of Madrid toll midnight. And though the whole of Spain may think its queen rules alone, here, in this quiet, holy dark, you finally see her truth. She doesn't want rebellion, she doesn't want devotion, she just wants someone to answer back. You drift now, listener, across the Bay of Biscay over the restless waters that divide Spain from England, and the candlelight of Madrid fades into the grey drizzle of London. The year is 1837 and the air smells of damp stone and chimney smoke. A 17-year-old girl, barely 5 feet tall, sits at her writing desk in Kensington Palace, her hair pinned up too tightly for comfort. Her name is Victoria, and before breakfast she will become the most powerful woman in the world. You picture her fingers trembling slightly as she dips her pen in ink. The door opens. A messenger kneels, breathless from running through rain. Her uncle, King William IV, is dead. And just like that, the small, sheltered girl who still sleeps with her dog Dash at the foot of the bed is now Queen of the United Kingdom. There's a pause, no trumpets, no fanfare, just silence. Then she says, in that careful voice that will one day echo through empires, "I will be good." It sounds almost like a prayer. You wouldn't think much of that promise until you realize how alone she is. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, hovers constantly, overprotective, scheming, exhausting. Her governess, Baroness Letson, dictates every breath she takes. The infamous Kensington system has shaped her life since birth. No unsupervised walks, no visits without approval, and never allowed to sleep without her mother in the same room. Imagine being 17 and still asking permission to open a window. When the courtiers bow to her that morning, it's the first time she's ever been allowed to stand on her own. She's tiny, nervous, and wearing mourning black. But there's a spark there, something sharp behind those blue eyes. Historians still argue whether that spark was ambition or rebellion, but it's unmistakably hers. Her first act as queen, she moves out of her mother's room. It sounds trivial, but in that palace it's revolutionary. She's no longer a caged bird, she's a monarch, and perhaps for the first time in her life, she breathes freely. Still, the palace corridors echo with old ghosts. Her father, the Duke of Kent, died when she was only 8 months old. She's spent her entire childhood surrounded by portraits instead of parents. She learned affection from dogs and discipline from a German accent. Her diary becomes her best friend, a secret companion filled with neat lines of copperplate handwriting and teenage exclamations like, "I cried much." or "So very tiresome, Mama." You can almost see her sprawled across her bed, pen in hand, writing to an invisible friend. "Everyone says I am queen now, but it still feels like I am watched." And she is. The Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, smooth, charming, twice her age, becomes her political tutor and, depending on which historian you ask, her first real infatuation. He flatters her intellect, calls her "my dear little queen," and teaches her the art of appearing confident even when terrified. Together they form an oddly domestic government, he the indulgent father figure she never had, she the eager student with too many emotions. London gossips hum with suspicion. One cartoon even shows Victoria perched on Melbourne's lap like a spoiled cat. The Queen pretends not to notice, but in her diary she writes, "I miss him dreadfully when he's not near." You chuckle. It's the most relatable line you've heard in royal correspondence. Still, her loneliness doesn't vanish just because she's wearing a crown. Power is exhilarating, but it's also isolating. She eats alone, rides alone, signs decrees alone. And at night, when the city quiets and the gas lamps flicker outside her window, she pulls Dash onto her lap and whispers to him about politics and people she can't trust. The little dog listens better than any minister. Here's a quirky tidbit. Victoria loved to draw stick figure cartoons of her own court, labelling them with sarcastic comments like "Lord M looking foolish again," or "Baroness scolding me for sneezing." If the monarchy ever collapses, she could have opened a comic strip. But beneath the humour, you sense something deeper, an ache she hides even from herself. She's surrounded by men twice her age, all convinced they know better. Every decision she makes is second-guessed, every emotion politicised. When she cries, they call her hysterical. When she stands firm, they call her unfeminine. You can practically hear her grinding her teeth through centuries of sexism. Historians still debate whether those early years hardened her or simply taught her to hide softness behind authority. Either way, she learns fast. Within months, she's reading dispatches until dawn, memorizing names of generals and duchesses, and practicing the royal wave before it even had a name. Still, the ghosts remain. One night, in the dim light of Buckingham Palace, the new residence she insists on moving into, despite her mother's objections, Victoria sits at her desk, the sound of rain pattering against tall windows. She opens her diary again and writes, "I long for someone who will not look at me as a queen, but as a girl." And right there, you glimpse the beating heart beneath the crown. She is powerful, yes, commanding, occasionally imperious, but she is also just 17, lonely, curious, and yearning for something real in a world built on performance. You almost wish you could tell her that help is on the way, that across the sea, in the fog-drenched streets of Coburg, a young man named Albert is polishing his boots, unaware that he's about to walk into one of history's strangest love stories. But for now, she waits. The lamps hiss, Dash sighs in his sleep. And outside, London's carriages rattle through puddles, while a girl queen stares out the window, wondering how to fill the endless hours between dusk and duty. Her reflection shimmers in the glass, half girl, half sovereign, and you can't help but feel that history has never looked lonelier. Morning in Buckingham Palace begins with the sound of footsteps and paper, the rhythmic shuffle of servants setting down the Queen's correspondence on polished mahogany. You imagine Victoria half buried in her bedclothes, blinking awake to the grey London light seeping through the curtains. She's been queen less than a year, but the letters already arrive like clockwork. Ministers, dukes, distant cousins, all telling her what she ought to do. And yet there's one letter she looks forward to, the one from her governess, Baroness Lehzen. Lehzen is the only person Victoria truly trusts, the quiet shadow who raised her when her mother couldn't be bothered. Stern but loyal, the Baroness is equal parts guardian and therapist, and she's armed with the most German of virtues, order, discipline, and a pathological fear of drafts. You can almost hear Letzen's clipped accent. Your Majesty must not forget her handkerchiefs, or the ministers will sense weakness. Victoria adores her, which in royal life is dangerous, because behind every governess stands an enemy. In this case, it's Sir John Conroy, the scheming advisor to Victoria's mother, still hoping to control the throne through maternal manipulation. He despises Leetzen, and Leetzen despises him. Their feud plays out like a slow-moving domestic war, fought with subtle insults and the occasional slammed door. It's funny in a tragic way. The most powerful girl in Europe still lives in a house where two adults are fighting over who gets to tuck her in. Historians still argue whether Leetzen's influence was stabilizing or suffocating. She encouraged Victoria's independence, but also fed her paranoia. "Trust no one," she whispered often, a line that would echo through Victoria's entire reign. You picture them at tea, the Queen slouching slightly, the Baroness straight as a sword. Outside the gardens hum with bees, but the air inside is thick with politics disguised as domestic chatter. Leetzen adjusts Victoria's posture. "A queen must never show fatigue," Victoria sighs. "A queen must never live either." It's the kind of line that never made it into her diary, but feels like it should have. The diaries, by the way, are Victoria's second life. She writes in them every night, pages of unfiltered thought, complaints, and self-conscious little sketches of her day. "I was quite cross with Mama," she scrawls one evening, "but then dear Leetzen said I should be patient." Another night, "I dance too much, perhaps. I do so love to dance." Sometimes the ink splatters where her hand trembled. Sometimes the lines blur slightly, as though tears fell and dried before she shut the book. You wonder whether she ever suspected that people would one day read those private words, dissecting her like a character in a novel. Probably not. Queens, after all, rarely get privacy even in memory. But her world begins to shift the day a new letter arrives, not from Leetzen, not from a minister, but from her uncle, the King of Belgium. It's short, formal, and oddly warm. He writes of family, duty, and a certain young man she hasn't met yet. His name appears at the end like a soft drumbeat. Albert. Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. You can almost hear the orchestral swell. Victoria doesn't swoon, at least not right away. She's practical, sceptical. "I cannot marry for mere affection," she tells Leetzen, who rolls her eyes, because that's exactly what she will do. When Albert finally arrives in London, he's 20 and serious, with eyes that see too much. He bows deeply, and for once, Victoria forgets to act like a monarch. There's a flicker, just a spark, but it's enough. Later that day, she writes in her diary, "He is so handsome, so sensible, so good." Then she underlines "so good" twice. Historians still debate whether it was love at first sight or infatuation at first relief. The relief of finding someone who might understand the strange, claustrophobic world she lives in. For a few weeks, she's radiant. The servants notice. The court gossips. Leetzen pretends not to. When Albert leaves, she weeps into her pillow, muttering, "He did not stay long enough." She waits 2 years before inviting him back, and by inviting, she means proposing. Because queens, unlike most women of her age, do the proposing themselves. It's a power move wrapped in a blush. You can imagine the scene. Victoria pacing in her drawing room, hands clasped, cheeks flushed. Albert arrives in full uniform, all princely composure. She greets him, stammers once, then says, "It would make me very happy If you would consent to marry me, he says yes, of course. But the moment isn't quite romantic, it's royal romantic. Equal parts sincerity and political choreography. The courtiers whisper, the newspapers explode, and somewhere in Spain, Queen Isabella probably smirks, thinking, another one trapped by her own destiny. Still, the engagement fills Victoria with a joy so bright it almost looks reckless. She dances again, laughs again, eats too many sweets again. She writes page after page about her beloved Albert, his intelligence, his modesty, his shoulders. The diary entry where she gushes about his shoulders would make a Victorian chaperone faint. But beneath all that sweetness, a quieter tension hums. Letton doesn't like Albert. Neither does the Duchess of Kent. They see him as a rival for the Queen's affections and, more dangerously, for her authority. The palace turns into an emotional battleground, the mother sulking in one wing, the governess sighing in another, and the fiancé patiently polishing his sense of superiority. You can feel Victoria pulled in all directions at once, the loneliness curling back like fog. On the night before her wedding, she writes, "My heart is quite full. I am happy, yet fearful. I do so hope it will be all right." It's such a human confession, so small against the weight of empire. And as she lies awake, the palace clock ticking through the hours, she probably doesn't know that tomorrow she'll begin not just a marriage, but a lifelong tug-of-war between love and duty, desire and control, self and symbol. Outside, London sleeps. Inside, the young queen dreams of a face she will never stop sketching in her mind, Albert's. And for the first time since her coronation, she isn't entirely alone. The bells of St. James's are still echoing when you find yourself in Westminster Abbey, February 1840, surrounded by flowers and fogged breath. The air is thick with incense and gossip. You can almost smell the orange blossoms woven through Victoria's veil, their sweetness undercut by nervous sweat. This is not just a royal wedding. It's a spectacle engineered to soothe a sceptical nation. England loves the idea of a young queen in love. The newspapers call it a union of virtue and beauty, which sounds like the title of a very boring novel. But the reality is warmer, clumsier, more human. Victoria, all 5 feet of her, clutches her bouquet like a life raft. Her hands shake. She's marrying the only man she's ever truly chosen, and in this rare moment, even the crown seems to weigh less. Albert, handsome and grave, looks at her with that particular expression, half adoration, half strategy. He's here to love her, yes, but also to reform her court, her household, and possibly her entire personality. No pressure. You can picture them standing before the altar, the gold of the abbey catching fire in the morning light. The choir sings, the ministers watch approvingly, and when the Archbishop pronounces them husband and wife, Victoria beams, a real unscripted smile. For once, the public sees a girl, not a monarch. Later, in her diary, she writes, "It was the happiest day of my life. I never spent such an evening." The triple exclamation marks were her choice, not mine. Historians still argue whether that sentence refers to marital bliss or the sheer relief of not being alone in the world anymore. But the honeymoon glow doesn't last long, not because of scandal, but because marriage itself is a strange experiment in shared sovereignty. Victoria is used to being obeyed. Albert is used to giving orders. You can imagine the friction, 2 clever, opinionated people trying to fold their egos into one royal agenda. She insists on her independence. He insists on efficiency. She calls him dearest angel, then sulks when he reorganizes her schedule. He wants to be her equal, but England refuses to let him. Officially, he's just a prince consort, a title that sounds like an afterthought and feels like an insult. At dinner, the conversation shifts between affection and argument. "Albert, I am Queen," she reminds him. "And I am your husband," he replies. And somewhere between those two truths, the marriage takes shape. Tense, passionate, and deeply intertwined. Still, Victoria adores him. She gushes about his intelligence, his moral discipline, his neat handwriting. When he walks into a room, she lights up like a gas lamp. When he leaves, she collapses into melodrama. "Without him," she writes, "everything loses its charm." Even her dog, Dash, starts following Albert around, which is either adorable or a betrayal, depending on how you see it. Yet the Queen's loneliness doesn't vanish. It mutates. Now it hides behind devotion. Every decision passes through Albert's approval. Every opinion gets measured against his judgment. She begins to rely on him so completely that ministers joke they're dealing with Her Majesty and his shadow. And perhaps they're right. Albert reforms her household, tightening finances, replacing inefficient old courtiers, installing German tutors for their future children. He turns Buckingham Palace into something closer to a disciplined boarding school. "Order is happiness," he says, straight-faced, while the servants roll their eyes. Victoria calls it sweet guidance. Everyone else calls it micromanagement. But at night, when the politics fade and the candles dim, you find them together, laughing, reading, sometimes sketching side by side. She draws him with soft lines. He corrects her proportions. It's both irritating and intimate. Here's a quirky tidbit. Albert loved to lecture about art history in bed. Imagine trying to fall asleep while your spouse earnestly explains Renaissance perspective. Still, their affection is genuine. They walk arm in arm through palace gardens, share private jokes, tease each other about their accents. She mocks his German inflections. He teases her for being too dramatic. "You English exaggerate feelings," he tells her. "You Germans suppress them," she shoots back. For a while, the palace feels almost human, full of laughter, music, and, soon enough, the cries of infants. 9 of them, to be precise. Each new child brings joy and exhaustion. Victoria, despite her legendary stamina, loathes pregnancy. "It is a horror," she writes bluntly, "to be like a cow." The morning sickness, the confinement, the endless parade of nurses, none of it suits her. "Children are delightful," she admits, "when they belong to other people." You smirk because it's the most honest line any royal ever wrote. And yet she loves her family fiercely, even if she sometimes forgets their birthdays. Between babies, duties, and a husband obsessed with efficiency, Victoria begins to vanish beneath her own domestic empire. Her days blur into schedules, audiences, dispatches, concerts, and diaper diplomacy. Historians still argue whether Albert's influence elevated her or erased her. He certainly helped stabilize the monarchy, turning it from scandalous to respectable, but he also reshaped her into a symbol of virtue rather than vitality. She no longer dances until dawn. She no longer doodles caricatures of her ministers. The diary becomes more restrained, her tone more severe. Even her handwriting changes, tighter, neater, less impulsive. Once, when Albert scolds her for losing her temper at a servant, she snaps, "I am the Queen of England." He replies calmly, "And I am the man who must live with her." Ouch. And yet, she forgives him instantly. She always does. Their love is equal parts tenderness and submission, a romance built on ritual. She calls him my all in all, he calls her my little one. To outsiders, they look perfect. To her, he's salvation. But you can feel the edges already fraying. Love this absolute can't help but become fragile. She builds her identity around him so completely that she forgets how to exist without him. And someday soon, though neither of them can imagine it yet, that devotion will turn into the deepest sorrow a monarch has ever worn in public. But for now, the Queen still laughs when Albert walks into a room, and he still pretends not to notice. The gas lamps glow, the city hums beyond the palace gates, and in the quiet between their bickering and their affection, you sense something rare in royal history. Two lonely hearts that actually found each other, even if only for a while. You wake with her in the grey chill of Windsor Castle, the kind of dawn that smells like stone and rain. The Queen stirs beside a dying fire, the room heavy with silence. Albert is already awake, of course. He always is. You can picture him at the window, impeccably dressed before breakfast, reading reports about sanitation reform while the rest of Britain still snores. This is what their mornings look like now. Order, discipline, affection, disguised as efficiency. Victoria stretches, half smiling. "You've been working already?" she asks, though she knows the answer. Albert looks up, the faintest glimmer of pride in his eyes. "One must use the daylight, darling," he says. And just like that the day begins. Their marriage, 5 years in, has settled into a rhythm both domestic and dynastic. They dine at 8, discuss policy by 10, stroll the gardens at noon. They even share a desk, his side stacked with memoranda, hers with letters and the occasional smudge of chocolate. But beneath the choreography of harmony, there's an undercurrent neither of them will name. Victoria's love for Albert has turned from thunder to gravity, less fiery, more consuming. She depends on him not only for companionship, but for validation. He, in turn, sees her as his life's project, a monarch to refine, a kingdom to modernize, a wife to perfect. You can feel the tension even in their most tender moments. When Albert corrects her letters, she bristles. When she storms out of a meeting, he sighs like a disappointed schoolmaster. Yet every argument ends the same way. Tears, apologies, and that achingly soft murmur, "My dearest, forgive me." Historians still argue whether theirs was the greatest royal love story or a very polite codependency. Probably both, but you have to admire them. Together, they become something England hasn't seen in centuries, a monarchy that looks almost normal. They walk hand in public, they play piano duets, they read Shakespeare aloud to each other by lamplight. The people adore it. The family on the throne, they call them, as though Victoria and Albert were starring in a long-running domestic drama about virtue and punctuality. Still, the illusion of harmony demands constant performance, every smile rehearsed, every photograph curated, every royal baby presented like a seasonal miracle. And behind those scenes, the Queen's old restlessness stirs again. One evening, after the children have been sent upstairs and Albert has retreated to his study, Victoria slips out onto the balcony. The air is damp. The lights of London shimmer faintly in the distance. Somewhere, a carriage rattles over cobblestones. She grips the railing, her breath visible in the cold. "You built me a golden cage, Albert," she whispers, not unkindly, "and I let you lock the door." Of course he doesn't hear her. He's too busy saving the empire. Albert's mind is a furnace of ideas: public housing, sewage systems, art museums, education reform. He works with relentless precision, believing that cleanliness and morality are the twin pillars of civilization. It's admirable, but exhausting. Victoria jokes that he has more interest in drainage than romance. Once, after he spent an hour describing improvements to London's water supply, she rolled her eyes and said, "Do stop talking of pipes and speak to me as your wife, not your plumber." Still, she admires him too deeply to resist for long. And when he smiles at her, truly smiles, she glows like a lamp newly lit. Here's a quirky tidbit. Albert once convinced her to let him design a new royal nursery with precise airflow calculated to prevent illness. He tested the temperature himself with a thermometer every morning. The nurses called it the princely weather report. You can't help but laugh. It's so wonderfully earnest, so hilariously German. But there's tenderness beneath the absurdity. Every baby, every reform, every grand plan. He's trying to build a world she can feel safe in. He's trying to fix the chaos that haunted her childhood. And for a while it works. The monarchy stabilizes, Britain prospers. Their children grow. The empire begins to idolize them as moral exemplars. Yet the cost of that perfection is isolation. You can't be both human and flawless. And Victoria feels that contradiction like a bruise. She still writes in her diary, but the entries are more formal now, more guarded. Gone are the exuberant underlines and scattered exclamation marks. Instead, she notes the weather, Albert's health, the children's behavior. It's as if emotion has been replaced by inventory. Every so often, though, the old Victoria peeks through. "I was cross today," she admits once, "for Albert corrected me before the children." And you can almost hear the pout that launched 1,000 reforms. Still, she loves him with a devotion that borders on worship. When he falls ill one winter, just a fever, nothing alarming, she hovers beside his bed, panic flickering behind her calm. "You mustn't leave me," she whispers. He laughs softly. "My dear, you would govern all of Europe before breakfast." She doesn't find it funny, because deep down she knows it's true, and she hates it. For all her titles and jewels, she's terrified of ruling alone. Historians still argue whether Albert ever realized how completely she'd built her identity around him. He probably did, but perhaps he didn't know what that meant, that when he eventually faltered, she would crumble too. You can feel it approaching, the inevitable turn. The fairy tale is too stable, too polished. The air itself feels like it's holding its breath. For now, though, the fire in Windsor still burns warm. The Queen still waits for Albert's footsteps in the corridor. The Empire still believes in their picture of eternal domestic grace. And you, the listener, can almost see it. The lamplight glinting off the inkwell, the soft sound of his voice as he reads to her from Milton, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. Outside, fog presses against the windows, muffling the world. Inside, history's loneliest heart has, for the moment, found someone who beats in rhythm beside it. The winter of 1861 comes quietly, like a guest trying not to wake the house. Windsor's towers gleam under a pale frost, and the Thames drifts sluggishly below, half-iced, grey as pewter. Inside, the fire crackles, the clocks tick, and the Queen waits for her world to fall apart. Albert has been coughing for weeks. It's nothing new, she tells herself. He's always worked too hard, always pushed too far. He skips meals, drafts letters until dawn, insists on inspecting drainage projects even in the freezing rain. But lately, his energy has thinned like candle flame. The royal physicians call it a low fever. You can almost hear the echo of every misdiagnosis in history whenever someone says that phrase. He sits by the window in his dressing gown, too pale, too polite, smiling at her with that same maddening gentleness. "I am quite well," he says. He's not. You watch Victoria hover, restless, pacing the carpet until it shows a faint, worn path. She brings soup he doesn't eat, lectures him about rest, sends for doctors who can only shrug. Each day he fades a little more, and the castle seems to dim with him. When the news finally comes, typhoid, not a chill, it's already too late. Historians still argue whether his death could have been prevented, but in this moment the debate feels cruel. All you see is a woman kneeling beside a bed, her hands gripping the sheets, like she might physically hold him here, through will alone. Albert turns his head, eyes half closed. "It is not so terrible to die," he whispers. And just like that, the light goes out. No fanfare, no ceremony, just the soft closing of a door between worlds. Victoria doesn't scream, she doesn't faint. She sits in silence so absolute it feels like a prayer. Outside, the frost thickens on the window panes, the fire hisses, and Britain's longest love story ends in a sigh. You can feel her world collapse inward. She wears black the next morning, then the next, then the next, for 40 years. The nation mourns, of course, but not like she does. Her grief isn't elegant or poetic, it's raw, obsessive, monolithic. "My life as a happy one is ended," she writes in her diary, her handwriting jagged from shaking hands. "The world is gone for me." From that day forward, Victoria becomes both ghost and monument. She retreats from public life, shrouded in widow's weeds, refusing to appear before her people. Ministers plead, newspapers mock. Even her own children grow frustrated, but she cannot move. Her love has become her mausoleum. Windsor fills with silence. She keeps Albert's rooms exactly as they were, the pens on his desk, the clothes in his wardrobe, even the water jug by his bedside. Every morning, servants change the sheets as if he might return. Every night she whispers good night to a bed that no longer warms. Here's a haunting detail. She continued to have his shaving set laid out each morning, the razors polished, the soap fresh. The ritual became her anchor. You walk through those corridors now, centuries later, and you still feel him there, the ghost of the man she refused to let time erase. Historians still argue whether her grief was romantic fidelity or psychological collapse. Perhaps it was both. In public, the Queen becomes the widow of Windsor. Her black dresses and solemn demeanour turn mourning into empire. The people, at first sympathetic, soon grow restless. They want a monarch, not a phantom. But she remains behind her curtains, writing letters to Albert as if he were merely abroad. And yet in that suffocating solitude, she becomes strangely prolific. She writes, reads, governs through correspondence. She insists that every policy would have Albert's approval. "He would have liked this," she notes in the margin of reports. It's grief as governance, an empire run by seance. There's a story from one of her attendants. The Queen once spent an entire evening sitting beside Albert's armchair, murmuring softly. When asked later whom she had been speaking to, she replied, "You wouldn't understand. You can't decide whether that's heartbreaking or slightly terrifying." And then there's John Brown, the Scottish servant who becomes her confidant, her comfort, her scandal. He's rough-spoken, loyal, entirely unimpressed by protocol. When he tells her to eat, she eats. When he calls her woman instead of "Your Majesty," she laughs for the first time in years. Of course the court despises him. The press calls him the Queen's Highland servant, which is both condescending and suggestive. Historians still debate whether they were lovers, companions, or simply two lonely people clinging to warmth. Whatever the truth, he breaks through her fog of mourning, just a little. And perhaps that's why she loved him. You picture her years later, older, heavier, still in black, walking through the misty gardens of Balmoral. The wind tugs at her veil. Somewhere behind her, John Brown clears his throat, mutters, "Careful now, Your Majesty." And she smiles, a faint, tired smile, but a smile nonetheless. "Thank you, Brown," she says. That tiny moment, unrecorded by history, but written all over her later letters, feels like the last flicker of human warmth in a life ruled by duty and death. Inside, Windsor still waits, the bed, the chair, the shaving set, all as they were. She'll never stop believing that he's there, watching, guiding, approving. Every night before she sleeps, she whispers to the dark, "Good night, my dearest." And for just a heartbeat, if you close your eyes and listen hard enough, you might hear him answer. The years pass, and the Queen of England slowly becomes her own monument. You can picture it, the black silk, the heavy veil, the down-turned gaze that photographers and painters immortalize 1,000 times over. She has turned her sorrow into an institution. Widowhood as policy, one wit at court mutters, half in awe, half in frustration. It's been years since Albert's death, but Victoria still speaks of him in the present tense. The prince thinks we should not trust the new prime minister, she tells her secretaries. The prince would disapprove of this tax. Historians still argue whether she truly believed Albert spoke to her, or whether she merely couldn't bear the thought that he didn't. Either way, she governs as two people, the visible widow and the invisible ghost. Inside Windsor, time moves differently. The windows are kept shaded, the clocks muffled, the mirrors covered in lace. Servants tread quietly, as though sound itself might offend the departed. When new visitors arrive, they whisper instinctively like tourists in a mausoleum. You imagine her desk, now more shrine than workspace, a framed photograph of Albert, his inkwell, his penknife, a lock of his hair in a glass locket. Next to them, her diary, pages and pages of grief in slanting handwriting, sometimes blotted where tears fell. All happiness is gone from me, she writes. I live only to honour his memory. Even her own children are powerless to pull her back. The younger ones grow up in a house where laughter feels like blasphemy. Her eldest daughter, Vicky, tries reasoning with her. Dearest Mamma, the people miss their queen. But Victoria's reply is curt and final. The people have their parliament. Still outside Windsor's gates, the world marches on. The empire expands, factories roar, steamships cross oceans. London buzzes with invention and ambition. But the woman who rules it all sits behind drawn curtains, sketching the same profile again and again. The high brow, the straight nose, the mouth forever half smiling, half scolding. Albert's face. The country begins to lose patience. Newspapers call her the Invisible Queen. Satirists draw cartoons of a cobwebbed throne. Parliament debates whether she should be forced to appear in public again. It's a rare moment in British history when sympathy turns to irritation. You can feel the contradiction tightening around her, adored and resented, sacred and mocked, powerful and irrelevant. And yet somehow that isolation becomes her armour. When her ministers finally persuade her to appear at the opening of Parliament, the crowd outside the Palace of Westminster holds its breath. The carriage door opens, and out steps the figure they've only glimpsed in engravings, a small, stout woman in full mourning black, her expression unreadable. The cheer that follows is not for joy but for relief. Their queen still exists. A journalist writes that day, she looked like a relic of a vanished age, yet her presence filled the hall. It's strange, isn't it? How grief, performed long enough, becomes majesty. Even her voice changes. Gone is the nervous stammer of youth. In its place, a low, deliberate cadence, the kind that makes even generals flinch. She learns to wield silence like a sword. Still, she has her soft spots. Letters to her grandchildren reveal flashes of the old Victoria, the humour, the warmth, the wicked wit. Be good, she writes to one, but not too good, or you will be dull. Another time, to a granddaughter nervous about marrying, she offers, you will not love every day, my dear. Some days you will merely endure. That too is love. It's the sort of advice only someone who has loved and lost can give. Here's a quirky detail. Victoria kept a small statue of Albert on her bedside table that she kissed every night before bed. Once, a lady-in-waiting accidentally dusted it without permission. The Queen didn't speak to her for a week. You can't blame her. Dusting away devotion feels like sacrilege. Even in her grief, she finds ways to rule. through letters, decrees, and the sheer inertia of habit. Ministers come and go, governments rise and fall, but Victoria endures. She becomes less a person and more a principle. A generation grows up never having seen her smile. And yet, when the empire celebrates her golden jubilee in 1887, 50 years on the throne, millions line the streets to cheer. The same people who once mocked her now weep openly as her carriage passes. Her veil still shrouds her face, but this time she lifts it just slightly and waves. A tiny gesture, but to the crowd it's as if the sun has risen. Historians still debate what that moment meant: forgiveness, closure, or simply duty. But you, sitting here in the hush of this bedtime story, can feel the deeper truth. It's not triumph, it's survival. She's endured longer than any of them expected, longer even than grief should allow. She has outlasted her critics, her contemporaries, her children's youth, her own sorrow's sharpest edge. What remains is something quieter, almost holy. She doesn't smile because she's happy. She smiles because she's still here. And sometimes, when the evening light hits Windsor just right, she swears she can still see him, standing at the window where he once read his papers, the corners of his mouth lifting in approval. "See, my dearest," she whispers, "I did as you would have wished." And maybe, for one heartbeat of eternity, she believes. He answers. You cross the North Sea now, leaving behind the mist of Britain and the weight of widowhood, sailing eastward into a harsher light. The air grows clearer, colder and sharper, the kind that smells of birchwood and snow. Ahead lies Stockholm, where another young queen once sat beside a window and wondered whether power was worth the price of being unloved. Her name was Lovisa. At 16, she marries a man she barely knows, the future King of Denmark, Frederick. It's the 1850s, and Europe, still reeling from revolutions, is once again trying to secure peace with weddings. And so, like so many before her, Lovisa of Sweden is chosen not for who she is, but for what she represents, a bridge between two uneasy kingdoms. You imagine the ceremony. Icy air, white gloves, polite smiles that tremble like the candle flames above them. Lovisa stands still, her veil catching on the embroidery of her gown. She is pale, composed and, if we're honest, already a little numb. Historians still argue whether she was shy or simply resigned. Her mother called her obedient to a fault. Her father said she read too much. The diplomats said nothing at all. They just signed the treaties. When she arrives in Copenhagen, the Danish court greets her with all the warmth of a well-oiled clock. The city smells of fish and coal. The palace smells of politics. Her new husband, handsome, courteous, already distant, welcomes her with a kiss on the hand. The next day, he returns to military drills and forgets to send for her. You picture Lovisa at dinner, sitting too straight, trying to understand jokes told in a language she barely speaks. The courtiers watch her like a rare bird that refuses to sing. Every time she lifts her glass, they whisper. Every silence stretches longer. And so begins her education in loneliness. Her letters home are full of small politenesses that ache between the lines. The king is very kind. The Danes are most considerate. The air here is damp. You can almost hear what she really means. I am invisible. Even her rooms feel foreign. The tapestries depict Danish victories over Sweden, a subtle reminder that she is here not as a partner, but as penance. At night, she dreams of snow on pine branches, of the crisp Swedish air that smelled nothing like the sea. Here's a quirky detail. She brought with her a pet cat named Gustav. It became the only creature in the palace she could speak to without caution. A courtier once found her reading aloud to it in Swedish. She smiled faintly and said, "He understands me better than most." You can't help but like her for that. Her husband, Frederick, is not cruel, just preoccupied. He sees her as part of his duty, like the Navy or the state budget. When they dine together, he talks of politics. She listens. When he finally looks at her, he sees composure. He never guesses that behind the calm sits a heart splintering in silence. Historians still debate whether Lovisa's loneliness turned her devout or whether her devotion became her escape. Either way, she begins spending more time in the palace chapel. The organ music becomes her lullaby. She lights candles for the souls of the dead, perhaps for the girl she used to be, and in her solitude she writes, not diaries, too risky, but long, unsent letters. Fragments survive, found tucked into prayer books decades later. One reads, "They look at me as though I am made of glass, yet no one sees when I am cracking." It's so soft, so devastatingly self-aware, that you almost forget she was only 18 when she wrote it. Time moves slowly in cold countries. The years pass in quiet repetition. Ceremonies, births, state visits, funerals. Lovisa bears children dutifully, smiles dutifully, prays dutifully. And yet she never stops yearning for something unnameable, a place where she might be loved without purpose. You picture her walking along the frozen gardens of Amalienborg Palace, the frost crunching beneath her boots, her breath rising like smoke. The city sleeps around her. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls. She stops, closes her eyes, and lets the sound wash through her. "I wonder," she whispers, "if God ever feels as lonely as his queens." It's a line no historian recorded, but it feels true. Still, she endures. There's strength in that quiet survival, the same kind that threads through all the young queens you've met tonight. Power does not always roar. It sometimes simply refuses to die. And Lovisa, though almost forgotten by history, carries her solitude with a strange grace. She learns to host dinners without trembling. She learns to speak Danish fluently. She learns that affection, when withheld long enough, becomes its own kind of armor. Her people come to admire her. They call her gentle, modest, pious, the compliments of a society that has never asked if she's happy. In truth, she isn't. But she does something remarkable anyway. She turns her stillness into influence. She funds orphanages, schools, hospitals. She visits the poor in disguise. A maid once said she saw the Queen kneeling beside a sick child, holding its hand as if it were her own. No fanfare, no portrait, no reward, just kindness performed in the dark. Historians still argue whether she ever reconciled with Frederick emotionally. Some say that in old age they grew close in a quiet, resigned way, the comfort of two tired souls who no longer needed to pretend. Others believe her heart stayed locked away, hidden inside the pages of those unsent letters. But one thing is certain, when she died in 1926, they found that same cat statue from her youth on her bedside table. The inscription beneath it read, in Swedish, "He listened." And maybe that's all she ever wanted. The room goes still again. The candle flickers. The ghost of Lovisa nods politely and fades into the dark. The Danish palace smells of lilacs and dust, of old wood polished until it gleams like amber. Years have passed since Lovisa's wedding, and she's learned to move through these halls like a shadow, graceful, quiet, always watching. She knows exactly how long to pause before answering a minister, how deeply to curtsy, how to tilt her head to imply agreement when she feels nothing at all. But there's one thing you can't master: sleep. Every night, long after the candles are snuffed and the guards take their posts, Lovisa walks the corridors barefoot, her silk robe whispering against the stone floors. The palace at night is a different creature entirely, its opulence stripped down to bones and echoes. She moves past portraits of kings with judgmental eyes, past doors she never opens anymore. Sometimes she pauses outside Frederick's study. The light is always still on. Inside, her husband sits surrounded by papers, letters, reports, military dispatches, his expression calm, detached, almost holy in its focus. She watches from the doorway for a long moment, then retreats before he can notice. He hasn't looked at her that way in years. Historians still argue whether Lovisa ever truly loved Frederick, or whether affection was just another state duty. But in her private letters, one theme repeats like a heartbeat: I wish he would see me. And so she writes what she cannot say. In her small, elegant handwriting, she pours out thoughts meant for no one. Fragments survive, pages folded into hymnals, tucked behind drawers, slipped into the covers of prayer books. He speaks to me kindly, but never truly to me. Sometimes I think I am only a figure in a portrait of peace. Last night I dreamed I was running. When I woke, I was still here. You feel that ache immediately. The soft, invisible suffocation of a woman whose cage is lined with silk. During the day, the world sees a model queen, composed, devout, unflinchingly proper. She attends services, hosts charities, and greets ambassadors with that serene, measured smile the Danish press adores. The Queen is an angel of calm, one paper declares. If only they knew how much effort calmness requires. A quirky detail emerges from a lady-in-waiting's journal. Lovisa kept a notebook of words never spoken. In it, she listed all the things etiquette forbade her from saying aloud. Lines like, I miss home, and I'm so tired of being virtuous. Sometimes, in the margins, she doodled tiny boats, sailing away, always away. You can't help but smile at that. A quiet rebellion in ink. One winter, when a violent storm hits Copenhagen, the palace shutters rattle and the servants whisper about omens. Lovisa sits awake, staring at the windows as rain lashes against the glass. Somewhere in the distance, the harbour bells toll for ships gone missing. She closes her eyes and imagines being on one of them, adrift, nameless, free. But she stays. She always stays. Historians still debate why she never returned to Sweden, even for visits. Some say Frederick forbade it. Others suggest she feared the humiliation of being pitied. But her own letters offer the simplest answer. I made vows before God. I must keep them, even if no one keeps theirs. That's Lovisa in a sentence, duty polished until it gleams like sacrifice. Her only true comfort lies in her children. She watches them grow with cautious tenderness, always aware that they belong to the state as much as to her. She teaches them Swedish lullabies, though their tutors discourage it. She whispers stories of forests and snow, small echoes of the home she left behind. One evening, her eldest son asks her, "Mama, are you happy?" She freezes, then smiles faintly. Happiness is for people who do not have crowns, she says. He doesn't understand. He will. By middle age, the mask has fused with the face. Lovisa moves through her duties like clockwork, measured, steady, untouchable. Courtiers call her a saint. Poets compare her to marble. The newspapers celebrate her unshakable composure. Only her cat, another, newer one, sees the cracks. Here's another strange tidbit. She once refused to sit for a portrait unless the artist painted her eyes looking away from the viewer. It is not a queen's gaze that matters, she explained. It is her endurance. You picture that portrait now, hanging somewhere in a quiet Danish gallery. A young woman, frozen in resignation, her beauty tempered by restraint. Tourists pass by without realizing they're looking at a confession in oil paint. And then there's the letter she never sent. Dated 1872, found decades later in the lining of a desk drawer. Addressed simply, to my husband. I know we are both prisoners of our crowns. I do not resent it, but I wish once that you had seen the woman and not the alliance. No one knows if she ever meant to send it. By the time Frederick finally begins to soften, his hair grey, his voice gentler, Lovisa has already learned to live without expectation. They dine together in silence. They walk in the gardens, two shadows bound by ritual. There are moments of quiet companionship, almost tenderness, but it's the tenderness of resignation, not romance. When he dies, she weeps exactly once. The court notes her composure approvingly, but her lady-in-waiting remembers something else. That same night, she burned a stack of old letters in her fireplace, watching them curl into smoke. "So much unsaid," she whispered. Afterward, she never speaks of him again. And when she herself dies years later, Copenhagen mourns her as the gentle queen. Her funeral procession moves through the streets in silence, her casket draped not in jewels, but in white flowers. No one mentions the letter. No one needs to, because in the quiet, graceful ache of her life, Lovisa had already said everything. The candle gutters. The Danish snow fades behind you, and the air warms as you drift south, past the black forests of Germany, over rivers glittering with starlight, until you reach a palace where laughter sounds like bells but means nothing at all. It's Versailles, 1770. The walls are gold, the mirrors endless, and the young woman stepping out of her carriage looks far too small for the life waiting inside. Her name is Marie Antoinette, and she's only 14. You can almost hear the murmuring crowd, the Austrian girl, the foreign bride, the pawn wrapped in satin. She's come to France to marry the Dauphin, the awkward, earnest boy who will one day become Louis XVI. Around her neck is a diamond cross, in her heart, a dread she doesn't understand yet. Historians still argue whether she was naive or simply too young to know better. But when she looks up at Versailles for the first time, the gilded gates, the scent of roses, the 1,000 eyes watching her, something inside her goes very still. She knows she's not here to live, she's here to perform. The handover ceremony is cruel in its symbolism. At the border between Austria and France, she's stripped of everything Austrian, her clothes, her jewels, even her dog. Naked beneath her new French gown, she steps forward, leaving her old identity behind. It's supposed to be a rebirth. It feels like an execution. When she reaches Versailles, the courtiers bow, but not too deeply. They smile, but not kindly. They study her accent, her walk, her posture, her laughter. Too lively, they whisper. Too frivolous. The young Dauphin blushes when she smiles at him. He doesn't know what to say. She doesn't know what silence means. They dine together that night at a table long enough to seat an army. She tries to make small talk. He talks about hunting. And that is how Europe's most famous marriage begins, with polite boredom and too many forks. In her letters home, Marie writes that France is beautiful but full of strangers. You can picture her at her vanity, scratching the quill across fine paper, while maids fuss over her powdered hair. Her mornings start at dawn with ritual dressing, literally. Courtiers crowd her chamber, fighting for the honor of handing her stockings, her gown, her gloves. The Dame d'honneur dresses her. The Dame d'atour presents her jewelry. If someone of higher rank enters halfway through, she must stop mid-undress and start again. Historians still debate whether she found it ridiculous or just unbearable. But one morning, after an hour of ceremonial chaos, she bursts out laughing. In Vienna, she says, I dressed myself. The courtiers look horrified. Queens don't dress themselves. That's Marie, too spontaneous for the theatre she's trapped in. Her husband, shy, gentle Louis, hunts, eats, tinkers with locks. He treats his wife kindly but distantly, as though she's made of porcelain. The marriage remains unconsummated for years. The court gossips, Paris laughs, pamphlets circulate. The Austrian woman cannot produce an heir. One pamphlet calls her Madame Deficit, the Queen of Waste, the puppet of Austria, the reason for France's misery. She's barely 19, and so loneliness becomes her crown. To escape, she creates her own world, a tiny pastoral village called the Petit Trianon, where she dresses as a shepherdess, milks cows, and pretends she's free. Historians still argue whether it was innocent escapism or a dangerous detachment from reality. But you can imagine her barefoot in the grass, laughing, feeling, for a few stolen hours, like a girl again. The irony, of course, is that her refuge becomes her ruin. The people of France see her play-acting as an insult. Bread prices rise, and they blame the queen who dances with lambs while their children starve. She writes to her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, "They hate me, Mamma, and I do not know why." Her mother replies with the kind of imperial pragmatism only a Habsburg could muster. Because they can. The court grows colder, rumours fester. Marie becomes both spectacle and scapegoat. If she smiles, she's mocking the poor. If she frowns, she's plotting treason. Ministers bow, then whisper. Even her closest ladies start keeping journals, not out of loyalty, but self-preservation. Here's a quirky little fact. She adored playing the harp. It was her escape, her meditation. In the evenings, she'd play softly while her ladies embroidered. Once, a servant peeked in and whispered, "The queen is making the air weep." You almost wish she could have kept weeping air instead of bleeding for it. As the years unfold, Versailles becomes a dream decaying in real time, perfume masking rot. The mirrors still shine, but the reflection has cracks. The king grows heavier, the queen grows paler. She gives birth at last, but even motherhood brings no peace. Pamphleteers call her immoral, foreign, and corrupt. Historians still argue whether her extravagance bankrupted France or merely symbolized a system that was already collapsing. What they agree on is that her isolation became unbearable. She once said, "I have seen people I thought loved me change in a moment," and so she stops trusting anyone. You picture her now, wandering through the hall of mirrors after midnight, her gown whispering over marble floors. Candles burn low, reflections shimmer like ghosts. She pauses before one of the mirrors, stares at her own pale face, and whispers, "Who will I be when they no longer need me?" Outside, the people are already marching. For now, though, Versailles still glitters, the queen still smiles, the musicians still play, but you can feel it, the faint hum beneath the laughter, like thunder gathering just beyond the horizon. And if you listen closely, you'll hear her voice again, almost inaudible, floating through the golden glass. "I wish someone would simply tell me the truth." But no one ever does. By 1785, Versailles is still dazzling on the surface, but only if you squint. Beneath the glitter, the cracks spread like hairlines in porcelain. The chandeliers still sparkle, but half the candles are reused wax. The fountains still sing, but fewer coins are tossed into them. Even the courtiers, powdered and perfumed, move through the palace like actors in a play no one believes in anymore. And at the center of that fading theatre stands Marie Antoinette, France's accidental villain, her laughter sharper now, her eyes too bright from trying to prove she isn't afraid. Outside, Paris starves. Inside, the orchestra tunes for another masquerade. You can almost see it, the queen gliding down the marble staircase, a fan fluttering in one hand, diamonds dripping from her hair. Her smile is flawless, but her heartbeat stumbles. Every whisper seems to say her name. Every silence feels like a threat. Even her allies have grown cautious. Ministers bow and speak carefully, as though her very presence were made of gunpowder. Her husband, Louis, still gentle, still distant, buries himself in hunting trips and cabinet meetings. He trusts her, but he doesn't understand her, and in a court full of daggers disguised as compliments, misunderstanding is fatal. The Queen retreats into her own world, smaller and stranger each year. At the Petit Trianon, the country estate she once filled with music and laughter, she now finds ghosts. The roses grow wild, the laughter echoes thinly. She walks the gardens in a plain muslin dress, refusing her jewels, insisting she prefers simplicity. Historians still argue whether this was early minimalism or royal delusion. Either way, the people of Paris find out and call her a hypocrite. When the infamous diamond necklace affair erupts, it doesn't matter that she's innocent. A priest, a con artist, and an ambitious courtesan conspire to steal a necklace worth more than most villages. They forge letters in the Queen's name, claiming she ordered it in secret. When the scandal breaks, the mob decides the story must be true. Who else, they sneer, would spend enough diamonds to feed a city? She weeps when she hears the verdict. The court acquits her publicly but condemns her privately. Even her laughter becomes evidence. She smiles too much for innocence, one pamphlet declares. It's absurd and utterly believable in a country collapsing under its own resentment. One quirky fact: the same week the trial ends, she orders a new harp. "I must have music," she says, "or I shall forget I exist." You can imagine her alone in her chamber, plucking soft notes in the candlelight, while the crowd outside chants her name like a curse. The Versailles staff hears the noise from Paris and pretends it's thunder. Louis, ever slow to act, tells her they will calm down. She looks at him, her face pale and still. They will not. Historians still debate whether she ever understood the revolution before it arrived at her gates. Some say she dismissed it as mere noise. Others believe she saw it coming but had nowhere left to go. In truth, she's already a prisoner long before the Bastille falls. Every day she's watched, measured, reported on. Her meals, her gestures, even her knitting patterns make the gossip columns. She tries to write to her mother again, only to find the courier intercepted. She starts burning her letters. Words are no longer safe, she tells her maid. The palace grows hostile. Courtiers vanish, friends flee. The corridors echo. There's a moment, small, almost invisible, that captures it perfectly. One morning she finds her reflection cracked. The great gilt mirror in her bedchamber has split down the centre overnight, a long, perfect fissure running through her image. A maid gasps. Marie just stares at it, then says softly, "How fitting." You can almost hear the silence that follows. Still she keeps performing. She smiles at dinners, curtsies at ceremonies, nods through debates she no longer follows. "If I must die," she says to a confidant, "I will die as a queen." That defiance, of course, becomes her legend and her undoing. When the mob finally marches on Versailles in October 1789, demanding bread, demanding her head, demanding justice she can never give, Marie stands at her balcony in a plain white gown. Below her, thousands of people chant, scream, wave torches. She doesn't flinch. Historians still argue whether she was brave or simply numb. One soldier who witnessed it said, "She looked neither proud nor frightened, only terribly alone." Louis surrenders before dawn. The royal family is taken to Paris. The carriages roll through streets lined with silence, save for the occasional hissed insult. Behind closed curtains, the Queen holds her children close and whispers the same phrase over and over, "Do not look out the window." In the Tuileries palace, she becomes a ghost in daylight, watched, guarded, obeyed only by habit. The windows are barred, the meals rationed, the letters censored. Yet even here she clings to ritual. Every morning she braids her hair, pins it with care, and greets the guards with perfect dignity. "Good morning, gentlemen," she says, as though they were her guests. It drives them mad. When her husband is executed 3 years later, she does not cry where anyone can see. That night she writes a letter to her sister. "I saw him once more. He was calm, and I was proud of him. I must now learn to die also." And she does. She faces her trial with the same composure she used to face the court at Versailles, head high, voice steady, silks replaced with mourning black. They accuse her of everything: treason, debauchery, crimes invented by pamphleteers. She denies nothing. She simply says, "I forgive you." On the morning of her execution, she dresses in white again, the same colour she wore the day she married. The cart rattles through the cobblestones, the crowd jeering. She doesn't look away. When she mounts the scaffold, she accidentally steps on the executioner's foot and murmurs, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean it." It's her last line. Historians still debate its meaning, grace, irony, or instinct. But you can see it clearly. The last performance of a girl who was never allowed to be anything else. The blade falls, the crowd roars, and somewhere, deep in the silence that follows, you swear you can still hear the faint, ghostly pluck of a harp-string breaking. The guillotine stands empty now, the echoes fading into the Paris morning, but the ghosts of Versailles never leave. You still feel them, the rustle of silk, the faint scent of rosewater, the echo of a girl's laughter trapped between marble and mirrors. Marie Antoinette's body is gone, but her myth begins almost immediately. The crowd that once jeered now gossips about her grace. Even her enemies admit grudgingly that she died like a queen. It's one of history's favourite ironies, that the woman accused of decadence becomes a symbol of dignity the moment she's silenced. Her son, the little Dauphin, languishes in a cell a few streets away, sick and frightened. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, survives, frail, bitter, haunted. She will spend the rest of her life trying to rewrite her mother's story, insisting that behind the diamonds and the laughter was someone kind. You can almost see the surviving princess decades later, seated in a quiet Paris salon, the candles trembling as she whispers, "My mother never said, 'Let them eat cake.'" She said nothing at all. Historians still argue whether Marie Antoinette was guilty of arrogance or merely guilty of bad timing. She became a villain because the world needed one, a scapegoat for centuries of inequality, a symbol to destroy so that change could begin. But she was also a girl who never stopped trying to be loved. And love, in royal history, is always a dangerous ambition. You close your eyes and picture her one last time, not on the scaffold, not in the crowd's roar, but in that small country garden she built for herself, barefoot in the grass, pretending for a single afternoon that she was free. Then softly, you turn the page. The continent is bleeding from revolution now, the old thrones toppling one by one. Kings flee, crowns fall, palaces become museums. And yet, even in this chaos, Europe can't stop producing queens. Some are tragic, some are clever, a few are both. Tonight, your path drifts south and west across the Iberian Peninsula into a city of hills and salt air, where the sea is blue enough to look like forgiveness. It's Lisbon. And the young woman on the throne here is barely older than Marie Antoinette was when she died. Her name is Maria II of Portugal, and she's inherited a country tearing itself apart. She's 11 when she first becomes queen, a title that sounds like a bedtime story and feels like a death sentence. Her father, Pedro IV, hero of liberal revolutions, emperor of Brazil, returns from exile to place a crown on her head and then dies almost immediately. The men of Lisbon hail her as the hope of the nation. The irony is immediate. She's a child who can't even reach the lectern where her decrees are read. Historians still argue whether her father's gesture was noble or cruel. He believed in liberty, but he also left her alone with it. Portugal is at war with itself, the liberals who want progress, and the absolutists who want the past back. And in the middle of that ideological storm stands Maria, wearing a crown that fits like a halo and burns like one too. You can almost see her at her first council meeting, sitting on an oversized chair, legs dangling, nodding solemnly, while generals debate battles she can't pronounce. She listens because listening is all she can do. At night, she studies maps instead of fairy tales. Her tutors tell her she must understand her country's geography the way a mother knows her child. But what she really learns is the art of pretending to be calm when men shout. Here's a small, odd detail. When the ministers argued too loudly, she used to recite multiplication tables under her breath to stay composed. By 15, she's already endured 2 coups and 1 failed kidnapping. The Queen must be protected, her advisers say, but what they mean is the Queen must be controlled. The court tries to marry her off quickly, the same solution Europe always finds for inconvenient female power. The candidates line up, dukes, cousins, princes of half-remembered duchies. She picks one, the Duke of Leuchtenberg, against everyone's advice. He's kind, young, unthreatening. Perhaps she sees a chance at normalcy. He dies of typhoid 2 months after their wedding. The court barely pauses before arranging another match. Prince Ferdinand of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, cousin to Prince Albert, yes, Victoria's Albert. Apparently, Europe's royal families are one long, complicated dinner party. Ferdinand is handsome, artistic, and polite. They marry in 1836, and for a while it seems like Maria might finally live something resembling happiness. They share a love of books and architecture. They laugh together, though she is often too tired to laugh long. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand truly loved her or merely adapted to her strength, but he supports her reforms, stands beside her in Parliament, and kneels beside her crib when their first child is born. Portugal begins to breathe again, and then, slowly, the sickness starts. Maria's health declines after childbirth. Tuberculosis, the old curse of Europe's palaces. She hides it well at first, but her voice weakens, her posture droops. Ministers whisper that she's become delicate. She hates the word. Delicate, she says, is what they call women they plan to ignore. Yet she keeps working. She still holds audiences, still signs decrees, still meets ambassadors who call her the little mother of the nation. You can picture her coughing softly into a handkerchief embroidered with royal initials, smiling anyway. One courtier wrote that she had the air of a saint who forgot she was human. At 34, she gives birth to her 11th child. She dies 2 days later. Her last words, recorded by a nurse, are simple. Tell them to be good to Ferdinand. It's such a small, tender sentence that you almost forget she was a queen, not a mother whispering into the dark. Portugal mourns her for months. Her coffin lies beneath the great dome of Estrela Basilica, where even now the light seems gentler, as if dimmed out of respect. Historians still debate whether she was one of Europe's first modern monarchs or simply one of its last tragic ones. But what you feel sitting here in the quiet is something deeper than politics. You feel the echo of every girl who ruled too young, who smiled for portraits, who died before she had time to be ordinary. The wind shifts through Lisbon's hills, carrying the scent of salt and incense. Somewhere, a bell tolls, a soft, tired note that sounds almost like a lullaby, and you can almost imagine her voice in it, faint and far away. I did my best. I was only ever trying to keep them safe. The Lisbon bells fade, and your mind drifts north again, toward cooler air, toward a time when Europe was learning how to forget its monarchs, but couldn't quite stop loving their tragedies. You pass over railways and telegraph lines, over iron bridges that hum with the new age. You pass, too, over a continent that once believed its queens were divine, and now sells postcards of them as curiosities. And in this shifting century, amid the ghosts of revolution and empire, there's one figure who refuses to fade, a woman with ink-dark hair, impossible waistlines, and eyes so haunted they make poets nervous. They call her Elizabeth of Austria. You know her name as Sisi. You can almost see her now, Vienna, 1854, the imperial courtyard glittering in gold. She's 16, barely more than a child, when she arrives to marry Emperor Franz Joseph, a man 8 years older and infinitely duller. The match was supposed to be between him and her older sister, Helene. But when Sisi stepped into the room, laughing and awkward, the emperor's heart did the one thing Austrian emperors were never supposed to do. It rebelled. Historians still argue whether it was love at first sight or simply the shock of someone genuine in a room full of porcelain. But by the end of the day, the engagement was set, and Sisi's life, for better or worse, was no longer hers. Vienna greets her as a fairy tale bride, tall, radiant, shy. But within weeks, she learns what every young queen before her eventually learned, that fairy tales are mostly paperwork and surveillance. Her new mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, runs the palace like a military hospital. She decides what Sisi wears, what she eats, even how her children will be raised. Sisi's opinions? Decorative. The first child is taken from her at birth. It's the imperial way, Sophie says coolly. Sisi smiles, nods, then weeps alone in her chamber while a nurse rocks the baby 2 floors below. You picture her standing by the window of Schönbrunn Palace, staring at the distant Alps. The sky is enormous. She is not. Here's a curious detail. She was obsessed with her hair, 6 feet long, chestnut brown, combed for hours every morning. The process took 3 hairdressers and gave her migraines, but it became her armor. When my hair is done, she said, I can face anyone. She also trained like an athlete, fencing, horseback riding, long walks that left her attendants gasping. Motion is my freedom, she told them. In truth, it was her rebellion. Historians still debate whether she was vain or simply starving for control. Maybe both. Vienna adored her beauty but distrusted her mind. She read poetry, quoted Heine, and wrote her own verses in secret notebooks. One fragment survives. They gave me robes of velvet red, but I would rather walk in thread. They gave me gold, they gave me fame, and took away my honest name. You can feel the pulse of every lonely queen in those lines. The years pass, Sisi's image becomes legend, painted, sculpted, mythologized. But the woman behind the myth grows thinner, quieter, stranger. She starts traveling endlessly, Switzerland, Greece, England. She rides for hours each day, often alone, often faster than her guards can follow. One journalist calls her the restless empress. She prefers the term unfound. Her husband adores her, but he doesn't understand her. You think too much, Franz Joseph tells her once. And you, my love, she replies, think too little. It's not cruelty, it's honesty. She's supposed to embody the empire's grace, but she's becoming its ghost. At 40, she's still beautiful enough to stop rooms. At 50, she diets on little more than milk and oranges. At 60, she's a shadow wrapped in black lace, walking through the world like someone auditioning for disappearance. Historians still argue whether her melancholy was born or made. Some say it was hereditary. Her family tree is full of poets and suicides. Others think it was the suffocation of empire, the endless performance of being adored. Here's a strange tidbit. She refused to be photographed after age 30. "Let them remember me as I was," she said, which is perhaps the saddest way to describe perfection. Frozen in youth, terrified of proof. And yet, for all her sadness, she was also defiant. She refused court etiquette, travelled incognito, befriended anarchists, spoke to servants like equals. Once, when told that a queen must not walk unguarded, she replied, "Then I am not a queen." And in the end, that rebellion killed her. September 1898, Geneva. Cece, now 60, wanders by Lake Léman, dressed in black, her face veiled. She is travelling under a false name, Countess of Hohenems. Her companion, Countess Starai, keeps pace beside her, gossiping softly. The day is bright, the water calm. Out of nowhere, a man approaches, a drifter, an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini. He asks if she knows the time. As she raises her watch, he stabs her once in the chest with a sharpened file. She doesn't even realize she's been fatally wounded. "It's nothing," she says, walking a few more steps before collapsing. Minutes later, she's gone. Historians still debate why he did it. Hatred of monarchy, desperation, madness. But to Cece, perhaps, it didn't matter. She had spent her life longing for invisibility, and in one cruel stroke, she found it. When the news spreads, Europe weeps. Franz Joseph stands by her empty dressing table, staring at her combs, her perfume, her gloves. "She was a little difficult," he says quietly, "but she was my life." And you, listening, drifting through the centuries, realize that all these women, from Isabella to Victoria, to Marie to Cece, shared the same invisible inheritance. Not crowns, but cages. Each learned how to turn sorrow into ceremony. Each was adored and alone. Each tried, in her own way, to be more than an emblem. But the world only ever wanted emblems. In a letter found among Cece's belongings, unsigned but likely hers, there's a final line that feels like a lullaby for every queen who ever looked out at a crowd and felt unseen. They call it solitude. I call it breathing. The ink stops there, but the echo continues. The fog off Lake Léman lingers behind you, and when it clears, you're back in Lisbon for only a breath. Then farther west again, across the dark Atlantic, where ships the size of palaces plough through moonlit waves. You drift inland to another court, another decade, where the world has just begun to believe that queens can be both human and political. The name whispered here is Maria II's daughter-in-law, but this part of the story doesn't belong to a princess at all. It belongs to the people who survived her, her husband Ferdinand, their children, the nation she left behind. After Maria's death, Ferdinand rules as regent, half mourning, half architect. He designs gardens that look like memory made visible. Long terraces of roses, shaded colonnades, ponds that mirror the sky so faithfully they feel like doorways. You can almost see him walking through Sintra's mist, the same hand that once held hers, now tracing the rough edge of a stone balustrade. He never remarries, the courtiers advise him to. He says quietly, "I married the last good thing I'll ever be given." You linger with him for a moment because grief doesn't belong only to queens. It trickles down to children, to servants, to nations. The palace staff still sets an extra place at dinner for years afterward, too afraid to ask when to stop. The musicians still play her favourite lullaby during state banquets. Historians still argue whether it was sentiment or superstition, maybe both. Portugal moves on the way countries do, new constitution, new rebellions, the same old hunger. But for decades afterward, people will lower their voices when they say her name, Rainha Santa Maria II, Saint Maria II, a title she would have hated, because sainthood, like monarchy, is just another kind of loneliness. You cross the map again, north to the mist, where the Firth of Forth glitters like a blade under the Scottish sun. And there, in another century entirely, another girl queen waits for her crown and her ruin, Mary Stuart. She's barely 6 days old when her father dies, leaving her the throne of Scotland and the inheritance of one of Europe's most fractious kingdoms. The nobles toast her name, then immediately start plotting who will control it. It's like watching vultures argue over a nestling. For safety, they send her to France, away from rebellions, away from the grey rain. She grows up in the glow of the French court, a charming foreign curiosity who can quote Virgil and flirt in 2 languages before breakfast. She rides, she hunts, she dances until dawn. The French call her la reine enfant, the child queen. She calls herself lucky. She isn't. At 15, she marries the Dauphin, Francis, delicate and bookish, with eyes that always look tired. When he becomes king, she becomes Queen of France as well as Scotland, a double crown for a girl barely old enough to sign her own letters. For one shining year, she seems unstoppable, beautiful, witty, and at last, home. Then Francis dies of an ear infection that turns into fever. He's 18, she's 17, and the French court wastes no time reminding her she's now expendable. Her mother-in-law takes her jewels. Her uncles take her influence. France, which once adored her, shrugs. So she sails back to Scotland, the land she left as an infant, and discovers that her crown has become a curse. The nobles are older, meaner, Protestant now. They see her Catholicism as treason. They see her beauty as manipulation. She sees a homeland that looks nothing like the one in her letters. Historians still argue whether Mary was naive or simply unlucky. But you can imagine her first night back in Edinburgh, rain hammering the castle windows, the fire refusing to catch, her French ladies huddled around her like lost birds. "They hate me already," she whispers. "They don't even know me yet." She tries to rule with charm. She tries compromise, diplomacy, laughter. It works for a while. The people call her Mary the Fair. Poets compare her to a rose caught in frost. But frost wins. It always does. She marries again, Lord Darnley, handsome, arrogant, disastrous. He drinks, cheats, boasts. When he dies in an explosion that everyone blames on her, Scotland turns against her completely. She flees south to England seeking protection from her cousin Elizabeth I, who offers her a guest room that is, in fact, a cell. 19 years of imprisonment follow, castles and manors always changing, each one colder than the last. She embroiders to pass the time, tiny, perfect stitches of gold and crimson. The patterns are flowers, but the messages are hidden, thistles for Scotland, roses for hope, knots for secrets. "My thread will outlast their chains," she tells her jailer once. Here's a quirky fact. She refused to eat anything not prepared by her own cook for fear of poison. When they replaced the cook, she simply stopped eating for 2 days in protest. Historians still argue whether she plotted Elizabeth's death or merely dreamed aloud of freedom. Either way, her cousin signs the warrant. On a grey February morning in 1587, they lead her to the scaffold at Fotheringhay. She wears crimson, martyr's colour, and carries a rosary of silver beads. The crowd murmurs prayers, the executioner trembles. She forgives him before the blade falls. In that moment, you realise how strange Europe's memory of queens really is. They live in silk, they die in wool, and they are remembered in legends that blur sorrow and spectacle until you can't tell one from the other. And Mary, like all the others, leaves behind only echoes, a few letters, a lock of hair, and a story that will be told forever by people who never once asked her what she wanted. The wind in Scotland still smells of heather and salt. If you stand on the cliffs near Edinburgh and listen hard enough, you can almost hear her voice, soft as rain. I was born to love, not to hate, but they taught me both. You can almost taste the rain on those Scottish cliffs, the sting of salt, the iron chill of wind through the heather. But the echo of Mary's last words fades, and the centuries turn again. Empires rise, factories cough their smoke across the sky, and Europe learns to trade superstition for science. And yet somehow the hearts of queens remain the same. Soft, restless, unbearably human. South again now, through grey skies breaking into Mediterranean blue. The bells of Lisbon are quieter these days, and in the distance the soft tolling reminds you of one more story, still waiting to be told. The life of Maria Seck's Portugal doesn't end with her. It ripples outward, touching those who came after her, the women who tried to live inside the space her courage left behind. Her youngest daughter, Infanta Maria Anna, grows up listening to stories of a mother who ruled and died too young. The servants whisper the same refrain. She was a saint. She was good. But the child hears something else hiding beneath it. She was alone. You picture the little princess walking through the gardens her father built at Pina Palace, the fairy tale fortress painted in pink and yellow, towers twisting like dream logic. The world outside is growing modern, mechanical. Inside she learns needlework, French verbs and silence. Her tutors remind her to smile softly, but never too often. The court has seen too many women smile at the wrong moment. She grows into a woman who understands diplomacy, but mistrusts intimacy. She marries late, almost a scandal in itself, to a German prince who promises stability. Historians still argue whether she loved him. One letter hints that she did, or at least wanted to. He is kind, and sometimes that feels like love enough. But the old sickness never really leaves the royal bloodline. The tuberculosis that killed Maria II hovers in the corners of their palaces, a ghost that smells faintly of lilacs and medicine. By her 30s, Maria Anna's lungs begin to fail. She hides it behind lace handkerchiefs and faint smiles. I am not ill, she tells her physician. I am simply tired of coughing up my memories. She dies quietly, without ceremony, in exile. Portugal barely notices, but the line of queens continues, like a candle flame passed hand to hand across centuries of draughty halls. Farther east, another flame catches in a palace by the Danube, where an empress who once rode faster than her guards now lies under marble, her tomb carved with roses and sorrow. They still bring fresh flowers to Cece's grave. Tourists whisper her name like a prayer or a password. Elizabeth. Her husband outlives her by 18 years. When people ask how he endures, Franz Joseph shrugs. I have the empire. But what he really has is routine, paperwork, meetings, solitude. He eats the same breakfast every day. He reads her old poems in secret. He forbids the palace staff to move her portrait even an inch. Historians still debate whether his devotion was romantic or penitential. Perhaps both. Outside, Vienna becomes modern. Streetcars, electricity, gramophones. But the Habsburg palaces remain caught in amber, haunted by women who died before they could age. In the galleries, the portraits of queens line the walls, pale faces, large eyes, delicate hands frozen around flowers or books. You realize that for all their differences, they look almost interchangeable. Every artist, consciously or not, painted the same emotion, longing disguised as grace. And that's when the pattern finally becomes clear. From Isabella's Madrid to Victoria's Windsor, from Marie Antoinette's Versailles to Cece's Vienna, the story keeps looping. Girlhood replaced by duty, affection replaced by protocol, identity replaced by image. Every crown comes with a script, and every queen spends her life trying to improvise within it. You start to wonder whether any of them were ever truly free, or whether freedom itself is the one luxury no royal treasury could afford. But even in that confinement there are flashes of rebellion, tiny, luminous moments that survive the centuries. Isabella whispering Libertad to her canary. Victoria throwing open her window to feel the rain. Marie Antoinette milking cows just to remember what it was to touch something living. Cece galloping through fog until the world disappeared behind her. Mary Stuart threading her prison with gold embroidery that no sword could cut. Each of them found a way, however small, to remind the universe, I exist. And maybe that's what makes their loneliness so powerful. Not the tragedy of it, but the resistance. That quiet insistence on being human in a system built to turn humans into symbols. Here's a strange, beautiful footnote. In the mid-1920s, decades after Cece's death, a Viennese historian discovered one of her notebooks hidden in a trunk. Inside was a short poem that had never been published, written in her neat, angular hand. It read, I am not a crown, nor marble face, nor memory dressed in lace. I am the pulse behind the veil still beating, though they think me pale. It could have been written by any of them, and maybe that's the point. They were not just queens, they were people who refused, quietly and stubbornly, to vanish inside the role. The wind off the Danube hums low, the candles of the crypt flicker. You listen, and if you lean close enough, you can almost hear it, a single heartbeat echoing across centuries, steady as ever. The centuries turn again. Steam gives way to smoke, smoke to static, static to silence. And still the quiet rhythm of queenship continues, like an echo that refuses to die. The names change, the palaces shift, but the pattern holds. A girl, a crown, a promise that begins as ceremony and ends as solitude. Tonight, your path drifts south once more, to a place where the air tastes of salt and candle wax, and the royal standard still hangs limp in the Atlantic wind. Portugal again, but this time a different echo, the slow unspooling of a dynasty's last tenderness. It's the late 1840s. Queen Maria II's portrait still hangs in Lisbon, her eyes painted too large, her lips slightly parted as if she might exhale. Beneath that portrait sits her husband, Ferdinand II, now a widower at 40. He reads by the light of a single lamp, surrounded by drafts of architectural sketches for his hilltop retreat, Pina Palace, a fantasy in pastel stone. He draws turrets that look like sugar sculptures, bridges that go nowhere, staircases that curl into sky. It's as if he's designing a dream where grief has geometry. Every night he adds a line to the blueprints. Every dawn he erases it. He calls it a palace for remembering. Here's a small, sad detail. He insists that no tower should ever be taller than the dome of Estrela Basilica, where Maria is buried. The dead must always look down upon the living, he tells the builders. Historians still debate whether Pina Palace is a work of genius or madness. Maybe it's both, a monument built by a man who could not bear stillness. He never remarries, though offers arrive from every corner of Europe. Instead, he fills his rooms with music. He collects clocks, hundreds of them. Every room ticks. So I may always know how long I've lived without her, he says. You can almost hear it, the overlapping pulse of time, like a mechanical heartbeat. When he dies in 1885, they bury him beside Maria. His epitaph reads simply, he built beauty out of absence, but absence, as you've learned, never stays buried for long. It drifts through bloodlines, through legend, through the faint thread of womanhood that winds from one crown to another. And so you follow that thread north again, to Scotland, where Mary Stuart's embroidered prayers have outlived her body. The linen panels she stitched in captivity hang now in museums, fragile as cobwebs. Tourists shuffle past them, whispering. They don't realize they're standing before the only diary she was allowed to keep. Each stitch is a syllable, each knot a heartbeat. There are thistles for defiance, lilies for hope, vines that curl into nowhere. One panel hides a Latin phrase, "In my end is my beginning." Historians still argue whether she meant resurrection or revenge. Either way, she was right. Her bloodline lives on, in kings, in myths, in movies, in the way people still sigh when they hear her name. You stand before her embroidery and think of all the other queens who never got to write their own stories. Isabella, whose canary named Libertad, was probably the only subject she ever ruled freely. Victoria, who turned grief into a second reign. Marie Antoinette, who discovered that silence could be both weapon and punishment. Sisi, who refused to let her photograph age even when she did. Lovisa, who learned to measure love by its absences. Maria, who coughed her last breath into a country that still whispers her name in church. It's as if they're all sitting together now, in some candlelit antechamber of eternity, comparing notes on the absurdity of being adored to death. You picture it, Isabella rolling her eyes, Victoria straightening her cuffs, Marie smirking behind her fan, Sisi staring into the dark and saying softly, "I told you so." And maybe, for the first time, they're laughing. Not the practiced laugh of portrait sittings, but the real kind, unguarded, alive. Here's a curious modern footnote. In 2012, a researcher analysing fibres from Mary's embroidery discovered traces of human tears preserved in the linen. Salt crystals caught between the threads, visible only under microscope. Proof, perhaps, that even royal sorrow obeys physics. Historians still debate the authenticity, of course, but you like to imagine it's true that even centuries later, the evidence of loneliness can glitter quietly under glass. You close your eyes. You can hear the wind sweeping across the roofs of Windsor, the bells of Vienna, the sea outside Lisbon, the rain on Edinburgh's castle stones, all of Europe breathing in its sleep, dreaming of its lost daughters. And somewhere, beneath all that sound, a quieter music plays. The pulse of women who learned to survive the impossible, one polite smile at a time. It's the sound of silk rustling, of ink drying, of history exhaling. And as you listen, you understand something the chroniclers never quite did, that every lonely queen was, in her own small rebellion, trying to remind the world that a crown is not a soul. The sound of silk and ticking clocks fades, replaced by something lighter, the quiet of dawn settling on the Tagus River, the first orange light hitting the pale stone of Lisbon's monasteries. The air here smells of bread and seawater. If you listen, you can still hear the echo of hooves on the old cobbles, and somewhere far inland, the slow tolling of a bell for a queen who once sang lullabies between coughing fits. It's morning, and Portugal is waking up without her. But even now her story lingers. In the habits of the people, in the soft way they still say Rainha, as if it were a prayer. The markets hum with voices. Sailors drink coffee so strong it could wake the saints. The cathedral bells sound less like grief and more like endurance. Maria II's Portugal has learned how to live with ghosts. Her widower Ferdinand's palace at Sintra, Pena, rises above the mist like a dream drawn in pastel chalks. Turrets in rose and gold, bridges arched for no reason but beauty. People still climb the long, winding road up to it and call it O Palacio do Amor. The locals laugh at the nickname, but whisper that it's true. A house built not for politics, but for longing. Inside, the rooms are kept much as he left them. The great salon still smells faintly of pine oil and lavender. The clocks still whisper from every corner. In one of the small chambers, a music box plays a lullaby that historians think Maria once sang to her children. No one winds it anymore. It plays when the breeze from the mountain is just right. If you stand there long enough, it sounds almost like breathing. Across the continent, Vienna is also waking to another kind of memory. The year is 1900 now, and the Habsburg Empire is fraying like old lace. The people talk more about railways than royalty, more about strikes than salons. But in a small cafe near the Ringstrasse, you hear someone humming an old song about Empress Elizabeth, the one they used to call Sisi. She rode like the wind, she sang like the sea, the chorus goes. She's been dead for 2 years, but her legend has only grown, each retelling polishing her sorrow into something almost beautiful. It's strange how the world always prefers its women tragic rather than complicated. The cafe door opens, a gust of winter wind rattles the glasses. An old newspaper pinned to the wall still carries the headline, "Assassination of an Empress." Beneath it, someone has scribbled in pencil, "She was already gone." You sit for a while, listening to the small sounds of the city, the creak of wooden chairs, the hiss of steam, the murmur of 100 languages. Vienna, like Lisbon, like Madrid, has learned to turn grief into routine. The empires change names, the palaces become museums, but the human ache beneath all that gold stays the same. And so tonight, the story narrows again, from empire to intimacy. Back to Portugal's royal chapel, dim and cool, where sunlight filters through coloured glass onto marble tombs. A guard stands watch, though few come this early. Dust motes drift through the air, catching in the pale rays of light. At the far end of the nave, beneath a dome painted with angels, lie Maria II and Ferdinand side by side. Her tomb bears the words Rainha e Mãe, Queen and Mother. His simply says, O Rei Artista, the artist king. You imagine them as they were, their fingers ink-stained from letters, their voices hushed at midnight, the long table between them cluttered with maps, plans, prayers. Maybe he hums while she writes, maybe she smiles when he forgets to eat. Outside, the river keeps moving, slow and silver. Here's a curious detail. Once a year, on the anniversary of her death, the choir from Estrela Basilica still walks up to the mausoleum and sings the same hymn that was played at her coronation. It's not an official ceremony anymore, just tradition passed down from choirmaster to choirmaster. The music fills the stone vault, wraps around the tombs, and then drifts out through the open doors into the Lisbon wind. No one knows how it started, no one dares to stop it. Historians still argue whether Maria's short reign truly changed Portugal, or if it only bought the country time before the next storm. But you know better. You've heard how small lives ripple. A kind word here, a law signed there, a lullaby hummed in the dark. And suddenly a century learns a gentler way to breathe. It's not the grandeur that endures, it's the tenderness. By evening, the bells start again. The fishermen light lamps along the docks. The city folds itself back into shadow, and from the highest tower of Pena Palace you can see both ocean and sky, the two blues that once framed Maria's life. You picture her there now, the memory of her, looking out at that horizon with a calm smile. The wind lifts her veil. Her crown glints once in the last light. She turns to you, not as a queen, not even as a story, but as someone who's finally been understood, and whispers the line that could belong to all of them. It was never about power, it was about being seen. And then she fades, leaving only the scent of lilac, the echo of clocks, and a silence so complete it sounds like peace. The silence of Lisbon stretches and thins, then breaks open into wind, the kind that carries you north, over the Pyrenees, over the grey spine of Europe, until you're in a country that smells of rain, stone, and smoke. Scotland again, but changed. The year is 1543, and the coronation banners hang heavy with mist. You are in Stirling Castle, and the sound of the organ trembles through the hall. The baby who will be Mary, Queen of Scots, lies wrapped in velvet on a gold cushion that seems absurdly large. Her crown gleams above her, held by a bishop whose hands shake as much from cold as from awe. Around him stand the Scottish nobles, half devout, half calculating. They chant her name, their voices echoing off the vaulted stone. Maria, Regina Scotorum. She's 6 days old. She can't even hold her head up. Historians still argue whether this moment was triumph or tragedy, but you can already sense the future in it. The child's tiny hands twitch against the silk. The courtiers glance at each other over the chanting priests. The crown is not a blessing. It's a question no one can answer yet. How long can something so small survive so much ambition? Her mother, Mary of Guise, stands at the edge of the ceremony, her face pale, her spine unbending. She knows what Scotland does to its kings. She knows what men will do to her daughter. Outside, the castle walls drip with fog. Inside, the baby queen yawns, and a herald writes the first sentence of a legend that will end in blood. When Mary is 5, they send her away, to France, to be safe from English armies and Scottish rebellions. She crosses the sea in a ship so battered by storms that the crew begins praying aloud, convinced the North Sea intends to swallow them whole. But she survives, stepping onto French soil like a myth washed ashore. France welcomes her like an adopted daughter. Paris glitters. The court smells of rosewater and gossip. Her cousins from the Guise family take her under their wing, teaching her the careful choreography of survival. When to curtsy, when to flatter, when to pretend she hasn't heard what everyone is whispering. The young Dauphin, Francis, blushes whenever she looks at him. They study Latin together. They write poems in secret. They play music in candlelit rooms that echo with their laughter. At 14, she marries him. The wedding is magnificent, the streets filled with torches and petals, the river glittering with fireworks. She's radiant, a queen in waiting, the envy of every court in Europe. Historians still argue whether she truly loved him. The letters say yes, innocently, fiercely, but love has never saved a crown. A year later, Francis is king, and suddenly Mary has 2 crowns instead of 1. Queen of France, Queen of Scotland, 17 and adored. Her mother-in-law, Catherine de' Medici, smiles too politely. The courtiers call her La Reine d'Écosse, and they mean it as both compliment and warning. But the fairy tale lasts less than 18 months. Francis, delicate from birth, dies of an ear infection that becomes a fever, that becomes a funeral. One day she is kissed by her husband. The next she stands beside his coffin, a black veil swallowing her youth. She's 18 when she sails back to Scotland, the queen who has lost a kingdom. The home she returns to isn't home at all. The French grace that enchanted Versailles looks like arrogance to her new subjects. The Protestants murmur against her Catholicism. The nobles, greedy and tired of France, circle like wolves. The palace she inhabits in Edinburgh smells of damp wool and mistrust. The servants speak a dialect she barely understands. When she smiles, they call it pride. When she frowns, they call it heresy. You imagine her on her first night back, sitting by the window watching the torches flicker in the courtyard below. Somewhere in the dark, she hears the faint sound of bagpipes. She whispers to herself in French, "Je suis perdue, I am lost." But she doesn't give up. She hunts, she rides, she learns the Scottish tongue. She holds audiences with rebels, smiles at enemies, negotiates with England. A woman can rule as well as any man, she tells her council, and half the room flinches. Historians still argue whether she was too clever or not cunning enough. She marries again. Henry Darnley, tall, charming, dangerously vain. He flatters her, woos her, wins her. Within a year, he's drinking through their treasury and flirting with courtiers. One winter night, a house explodes in Edinburgh. They find Darnley's body in the garden, strangled but untouched by the blast. The city whispers one name, Mary. They call her the murderous queen. Within months, she marries the man everyone suspects, Bothwell, the brash noble who may have killed her husband. The scandal is instant, the rebellion swift. Her own army turns against her. She's imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, forced to sign her abdication in favour of her infant son. She escapes, daringly, briefly, and rides into battle with her loyalists. They lose, and then she flees south to England, to her cousin Elizabeth, the one woman who might understand what it means to be both sovereign and trapped by it. She crosses the border believing she will find refuge. Instead, she finds a cage. For 19 years, she's kept moving from fortress to fortress, her world shrinking to the size of a tapestry frame. She embroiders to keep her sanity tiny, intricate flowers that hide secret mottos. Truth conquers all. Hope lives. My end is my beginning. Historians still argue whether she truly plotted Elizabeth's death or whether the letters were forged. But it doesn't matter. The verdict is the same. She's 54 when they lead her into the great hall of Fotheringhay. The air smells of wood smoke and iron. The scaffold waits draped in black. She wears crimson, martyr's colour. Her hair is streaked with silver now, her eyes still bright. She smiles at the crowd. "I am the Queen of Scots," she says, "condemned to die by those I have never wronged." And when the executioner kneels for her forgiveness, she answers softly, "I forgive you with all my heart." The first blow misses, the second ends a century. For a moment the world is very still. The air shivers. Then the legend begins. Painters will soften her features, poets will polish her words, her enemies will call her reckless, her admirers romantic. But the truth is simpler. She was a woman born into a game that no woman could win, who still tried to play with grace. And in that final breath, head high, voice steady, dignity intact, she becomes the mirror in which every lonely queen sees herself. The echo of that blade still rings in the cold air of Fotheringhay, but you step away from it, down the long corridor of centuries, where the ghosts of queens blur together, veils, lace, candlelight, and the faint scent of lavender and old paper. The world changes around them. Muskets become telegraphs, horses become trains, monarchies crumble and resurrect. Yet the rhythm stays the same: adoration, isolation, endurance. Tonight your path curves eastward again toward Belgium, a small, careful country carved out of Europe's ambitions, where another young woman is about to learn that love, too, can be a kind of exile. Her name is Marie Henriette of Austria, and she's 16 when she marries Leopold II, heir to the Belgian throne. The match is arranged, as always, by families and diplomats. She brings her dowry and her good breeding. He brings power, duty, and a smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes. The wedding bells ring in Brussels, the crowds cheer, the newspapers call it a union of youth and promise. They always say that. Historians still argue whether the marriage was doomed from the start or destroyed in slow motion. Leopold is ambitious, brilliant, and increasingly cold. Marie Henriette is sensitive, artistic, and far too honest for a court that measures worth in silence. In her first letter home, she writes, "They smile, but they do not laugh. It feels like I have moved into a painting where the air is missing. You can picture her in that first winter at Laken Palace, wandering through rooms so large they echo her footsteps back at her like mockery. The draperies are too heavy, the ceilings too high. Every day begins with ceremony and ends with etiquette. Even her horse, her one real comfort, is groomed by servants who bow before they touch the reins. She loves riding more than she loves breathing. It's the one place she feels unobserved. She gallops across the Belgian countryside with her hair whipping behind her, the air sharp and clean. The farmers stare after her, startled. No queen has ever looked so alive or so intent on escape. But when she returns to the palace, the world hardens again. Leopold greets her with polite distance. He admires her composure, criticizes her candor, and grows colder every year. The courtiers sense it, of course. They begin treating her like a figurehead, beautiful, silent, replaceable. Historians still debate whether she loved him or simply endured him. Her diaries, when they surface years later, contain only brief entries. Leopold met with ministers. Rain again. The chestnut mare limps. You can feel the restraint pressing against each line, like grief behind glass. And yet she refuses to disappear. While her husband chases colonial ambitions in Africa, dreams that will stain his legacy forever, Marie Henriette builds her own kind of kingdom in the stables behind the palace. She breeds horses, rescues strays, even sneaks into the barns at night to care for them herself. A horrified attendant once caught her ankle-deep in hay, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing a mare's wound. "Your Majesty," he gasped, "this is not proper." She smiled faintly. "Then close your eyes," she said. Here's a small, perfect detail. She keeps a small portrait of one favorite horse on her writing desk, its mane braided with blue ribbon. On the back, she writes, "He never lied to me." Her daughters grow up quietly, learning early not to mention their father when she's near. The youngest, Louise, will one day rebel spectacularly, running away with a lover, sparking scandal. The newspapers will blame her mother's coldness, but those who knew them both will say it differently. The child inherited the mother's hunger for something true. The years pass. Queen becomes the silent duchess, retreating more and more into the countryside, to Spa, an estate of forests and mist where she can ride for hours without seeing another human soul. She builds a small chapel there, white stone and ivy, where she prays not for herself, but for peace between her daughters and their father. The candles she lights burn low and steady, like endurance made visible. Historians still argue whether her piety was faith or resignation. The truth, as always, is probably both. By her 50s, she no longer attends court. Leopold hardly notices. He's busy turning the Congo into a personal empire, rewriting morality into profit, and building monuments to his own ego. Belgium loves him for a while, then whispers about him forever. Marie Henriette says nothing. She cannot stop him. She can only refuse to celebrate him. Here's the strange mercy of age. She stops pretending. She rides every morning until her body won't allow it. She reads poetry in French and German. She plays piano until her fingers ache. When her attendants curtsy too deeply, she laughs. "I'm only a woman," she says, "not a statue." In her last years, she returns again to her horses. One in particular, a grey stallion named Orion, follows her like a dog. They say that when she died, Orion refused to eat for 3 days, standing by the fence as if waiting for her to come back. And in a way, she never left. When she's buried, they drape her coffin not in silk, but in simple linen, embroidered with lilies. The people of Spa line the road to watch her procession pass, hats in hand, silent. Some weep openly. One old groom whispers, "She was kind, that's all that matters." You realize, listening to that line, how far the story has traveled, from thrones to quiet kindness, from the roar of coronations to the hush of stables. Marie Henriette's life may not have changed the world, but it softened it. And that, in the long ledger of history, might be the braver thing. The rain begins again over Belgium. The palace windows glow faintly. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighs once, sharply, then falls silent. The Belgian rain keeps falling, slow and stubborn. It slicks the cobblestones, drips from the marble gargoyles of Laeken, and pools in the hollows of the palace gardens. The world outside is turning modern. Streetcars rattle, factory whistles puncture the grey. But inside, the old rhythms persist. The guards change, the lamps are lit, the portraits stare back. Leopold II still sits on his throne, old now and restless, a man haunted not by conscience, but by ghosts he refuses to name. The papers no longer call him the Builder King, they call him the Butcher. Belgium's fortune grows on the blood of Congo's forests, and everyone knows it. Everyone except him, or rather, everyone but him, admits it aloud. Marie Henriette is gone, laid to rest in the quiet hills near Spa. The palace feels emptier for it, though Leopold never says so. Instead, he fills his nights with plans for monuments, stone, bronze, anything that will make people forget the smell of rubber and fire. But grief, like smoke, lingers even in palaces. The servants say they still hear the echo of hooves in the courtyard, though no horses have been kept there since her death. And while Leopold's world contracts into marble and denial, another story unfolds quietly at the edge of empire, further east in Vienna again. The Habsburg dynasty is entering its long twilight. The old emperor Franz Joseph, widower of Sisi, rules alone. His mornings are filled with paperwork, his evenings with silence. The empire is coming apart, but he clings to ritual as if it were religion. He still takes breakfast at precisely 7. He still signs every document with his neat, deliberate script. He still keeps his late wife's portraits exactly where she left them, one in every room, each facing a window. She loved the light, he explains to no one. It's strange how grief becomes architecture. His court, once the glittering envy of Europe, is now a mausoleum of manners. The young archdukes grow bored, restless. The empire grows brittle, held together by paperwork and nostalgia. And yet, even here, the echoes of the old queens endure. Their names are still whispered at banquets, their portraits still studied by debutantes who've never known real silence. You can almost feel it, the weight of all that memory pressing against the present. Historians still argue whether Franz Joseph's devotion to Sisi was love or penance. In truth, it doesn't matter. He believed, as so many men of his century did, that loss could be controlled through order. So he built order like a fortress. In one of his private letters discovered years later, he wrote, "I have outlived beauty, music, and laughter. What remains is duty, and that must be enough." It's not. But he never admits that. Across Europe, the tide of queens begins to recede. Their portraits still hang, but their palaces start sprouting telegraph wires, motor cars, and electric lamps. The world no longer needs them to pray or inspire. It needs them to adapt, to smile for cameras, to be modern. You can almost sense them stiffening in those early photographs. Women raised to be mysteries, now caught in the merciless clarity of light. The old language of queenship, grace, virtue, sacrifice sounds strange next to factories and trains. History is moving faster than elegance can keep up. But even as their power fades, their humanity becomes more visible. The myth cracks, and through it you glimpse the women themselves. In a small archive in Vienna, a curator finds one of Cece's journals that had been thought lost. Inside is a poem written after her daughter, Sophie's death. I stand in the garden and call her name. The wind answers, and I believe it. In Madrid, a surviving maid of Isabella II recalls the Queen's laughter echoing through the corridors on the day she finally abdicated. She sounded free, the woman says, like a child running downhill. In Denmark, a stable hand keeps the bridle that once belonged to Queen Lovisa's favourite mare. When asked why he keeps it polished, he shrugs. Because she was kind. In Lisbon, a bell still rings each year on the day Maria II died. No one remembers who first rang it. No one dares to stop. And then there's the new century. Motor cars, suffrage, electricity, war. The crowns are still there, but lighter now, hollowed of their old terror. The queens of the 20th century inherit the ghosts of all the others, but not their silence. They wave from balconies instead of praying in chapels. They learn to speak to cameras, to smile for strangers. The distance between throne and people shrinks, but so does the magic. The world has grown louder. There's less room for loneliness, yet somehow it remains. The same corridors, the same endless duties, the same measured grace that never quite covers the ache beneath it. Historians will write about politics and revolutions, but what lasts are the quieter things. The stitched flowers on Mary's linen, the broken slipper from Isabella's dance, the hairpins scattered on Cece's vanity. Fragments, yes, but they tell more truth than the marble statues ever could. You stand now at the edge of that truth, the air of Europe around you full of dust and perfume, the echoes of centuries humming in your ears. You think of all those women, crowns too heavy, hearts too fragile, and realize they were not ghosts after all. They were mirrors, and when you look into them, what you see reflected isn't royalty. It's yourself. Loneliness dressed as composure, longing disguised as grace. The palaces fade, the bells fall silent, only the quiet remains. And in that quiet one last whisper, centuries old but clear as breath. Remember me kindly, not for what I was, but for what I endured. You stand in that quiet for a long time, surrounded by echoes, before the story carries you forward again. Forward into the last, trembling edge of the old Europe, where the scent of violets and gunpowder hang in the same air. The 20th century has arrived, and the world that once bent itself around queens now begins to spin without them. And yet, not completely. Somewhere in the north, the streets of Brussels gleam under new electric lamps. The carriages are gone. The first automobiles sputter along the cobblestones. Inside the royal palace, the widower Leopold II is finally dead. The servants cross themselves as the body cools, not from sorrow, but relief. Belgium is tired of kings, and in that hush for the first time, the whisper of his late wife's horses seems to fade. Marie Henriette's quiet mercy outlasted his monuments. History has a strange sense of justice. Farther south in Madrid, the last Bourbon monarchs shuffle through rooms that smell of dust and nostalgia. Isabella II's grandchildren now rule in her place. Spain is fractured again, the court exhausted by its own ghosts. But on the anniversary of her death, a single bouquet of violets still appears at the gate of the royal chapel. No one knows who leaves it. The attendants call it la flor del perdón, the flower of forgiveness. A nation that once mocked her now remembers her with a kind of weary tenderness. She was flawed, capricious, often cruel to herself and others, but she lived fully, messily, and loudly. You can almost hear her laugh echoing through the centuries. At least I was never boring. It's the best epitaph any queen ever wrote. Across the Channel, Queen Victoria's empire is breaking under its own weight. Colonies rise, industries roar, cities smother in coal dust. The Queen herself has gone her long reign, closing like the last chapter of an epic novel no one quite finished. London builds statues of her on every corner, as if afraid she'll be forgotten if not multiplied. But memory is trickier than marble. The empire she built in her name now questions the very idea of empire. Her great-granddaughters will walk through the ruins of a century she helped define. The crown survives, but only just. In the archives of Windsor, someone finds her final private note to Albert, written decades after his death and sealed among his belongings. "I am so tired of the daylight. I long for the quiet where I can hear you." Historians debate whether it was poetic flourish or confession. You think it was both. The candle of monarchy still burns, but the flame trembles. The world is learning how to belong to itself. And still the echo continues, because history, it turns out, has a long memory for lonely women in silk. At the very dawn of the new century, a British journalist travels through Europe to write a book called Queens of Yesterday. He visits the palaces, interviews the aging servants, studies the portraits. His conclusion, written in the last line of his notebook, is almost offhand. They were all lonely, but they made the loneliness beautiful. He doesn't realize that's exactly what kept them alive in memory. Their ability to turn isolation into art, decorum into defiance, silence into legend. You picture him standing before Cece's portrait in Vienna, pen hovering above the paper. He's surrounded by tourists in hats and coats, the murmur of multiple languages blending into the hush of reverence. He stares up at the Empress's eyes, still as bright, still as unknowable, and writes nothing. Because what could he possibly add? The artist who painted her once said, "She would not let me capture her. She wanted to be remembered, not known." That line could belong to every queen in this story. And now you find yourself back where you began, among their echoes. The castles, the corridors, the endless mirrors, the sound of silk brushing marble, the faint hum of a world that learned both love and loneliness from the women it put on pedestals. If you listen closely, they're still speaking. Isabella, from the echoing halls of Madrid. Power is never enough. Victoria, from behind her lace curtains. Love is the longest crown. Marie Antoinette, from her ruined garden. Be careful what you pretend to be. You may become it. Cece, from the edge of her mirror. The sky was my only freedom. Mary Stuart, from the scaffold. In my end is my beginning. And Maria of Portugal, softly, almost shyly. I did my best. Their words weave together like a lullaby for a continent that forgot how to rest. Historians still argue about their legacies. They measure their reigns in treaties and scandals, in births and deaths. But you, drifting through the hush of their afterlives, understand that the truth lies somewhere smaller, between stitches, between heartbeats. The loneliness of Europe's youngest queens was never just tragedy. It was the price of grace in a world that mistook obedience for strength. And maybe, in the end, it's not a sad story at all. Maybe it's the sound of endurance, the quiet, stubborn kind that keeps going long after the last candle dies. The air is still again. The palaces fade to dusk. You exhale. Somewhere far away, a bell rings once, soft as a heartbeat. It feels like goodbye. The bell fades, but its vibration lingers in the bones of Europe. The sound hums through train stations and city squares, through museums filled. Something went wrong while generating the response. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. The bell you hear rings through centuries, slow, solemn, steady. It echoes off empty palaces, crosses oceans, slips under doors where dust collects on forgotten portraits. And with that sound, the world of kings and queens, as it once was, exhales one last time. It's the early 1900s now, and Europe has entered its age of endings. Monarchs die quietly in their sleep or loudly in revolutions. Trains move faster than royal processions. Cameras outlive coronations. What once seemed eternal, crowns, courts, divine rights, now feels almost quaint. And yet, here and there, in the quiet corners of history, you still catch glimpses of the old rhythm, the fragile human heart, beating beneath the glittering cage. In Vienna, Emperor Franz Joseph grows old, very old, surrounded by silence. He lives alone in his palace, his servants, too polite to mention the echo of footsteps that sometimes follow him down empty halls. They say he talks to portraits now. When he pauses before the one of Elizabeth, his Sisi, he whispers, "Forgive me for outliving you." He dies in 1916, worn down by the First Great War, by grief, by time itself. His empire dies 2 years later. The Habsburg banners are taken down. The palaces become museums, their marble floors polished for tourists instead of courtiers. And still, somewhere deep in the Schönbrunn archives, Sisi's handwriting waits in a locked drawer. Poems about freedom no one thought to read until decades later. In England, Victoria's grandchildren sit on thrones of their own. Germany, Russia, Norway, Greece. All bound by her blood, all about to destroy one another. The Great War devours them one by one, until the European family she built tears itself apart. The empires fall, the soldiers march, and somewhere in the smoke of the Western Front, a century quietly ends. Victoria's descendants will survive, of course, because the British crown, stubborn as weather, always does. But the magic she once lent it, the sanctity of sorrow, the illusion of moral weight, evaporates. What remains is pageantry, televised and polite. Queens no longer rule. They reign, they wave, they smile for cameras. They outlive their own relevance with grace. Historians still argue whether that's tragedy or triumph. You suspect it's both, and then the rest. Spain loses its monarchy, gains it, loses it again. Portugal becomes a republic, its palaces turned into offices and libraries. France never looks back. Its last queen's bones rest under a chapel floor where tourists light candles without quite remembering who she was. Belgium and Denmark keep their crowns, but lighter now, worn more like symbols than armor. All the while, the ghosts remain, each palace with its peculiar hush, each portrait with that same steady gaze, half sadness, half defiance. You walk among them now. The museum lights hum softly overhead. In one glass case, Isabella's child-sized crown gleams beside a faded lace glove. In another, a lock of Sisi's hair, dark, glossy, impossibly long, coiled like memory itself. A small placard beneath it reads, Elizabeth of Austria, 1837-1898. I love the sky more than the court. The visitors murmur, take photographs, move on, you linger. Because behind all this glass and silence lies the truth that history still struggles to say out loud, that every symbol of power was also a prison. And then you find it, the final artifact, tucked into the corner of the exhibit, a small embroidered handkerchief, pale with age. The stitching along its edge reads, loneliness is the price of being remembered. No one knows who stitched it. Some say Victoria, others think Mary Stuart. Still others whisper it was one of Maria's daughters, long forgotten. But perhaps it doesn't matter. The sentiment belongs to all of them. You picture them together, not as queens, but as women, sitting at the same long table somewhere beyond time, their crowns set aside, their hands wrapped around teacups, laughing softly at the absurdity of it all. Isabella teasing Victoria for her seriousness. Marie Antoinette pretending to sip wine and then whispering, It was always terrible. Mary Stuart humming under her breath. Cece smiling for once, just smiling. And Maria at the far end, her voice quiet but steady. At least we tried. The laughter rises, fades, the scene blurs like candle smoke. And you realize maybe that's what this story was always meant to be. Not a tragedy, not a cautionary tale, but a requiem for endurance. A reminder that every lonely heart, crowned or not, still beats toward the same small, ordinary hope. To be seen and to be remembered kindly. Outside, the museum doors open onto dusk. The city hums with its own kind of royalty now. Neon signs, sirens, hurried footsteps, strangers holding hands. The age of queens is over, but the ache that shaped them lives quietly in everyone who has ever felt unseen. The wind brushes past you like silk. Somewhere, far away, a clock chimes 7, the old hour for vespers, or perhaps for stories ending. And in that fading light you hear the final whisper, the voice of all of them together, soft, amused, unbearably human. We were lonely, yes, but we were magnificent. You step outside into the dusk and realize the world has turned entirely modern. Neon signs hum over cafes where once there were candlelit salons. Electric trams rattle past buildings that still remember coronations. The sky has gone that deep, patient blue that belongs only to cities built on ghosts. But the queens are still here, everywhere, if you know how to see them. In the mirrored windows of storefronts, you catch glints of them. Cece's sharp profile, Victoria's steady gaze, Mary Stuart's determined mouth. They appear not as spectres, but as fragments of reflection folded into the lives of ordinary women hurrying home from work, pausing at crosswalks or standing in the rain with their thoughts somewhere else entirely. Because the truth is their stories never ended in marble or mausoleum. They dissolved into the bloodstream of the modern world, into the posture of a woman speaking her mind in a meeting, into the silence of another one refusing to apologize for needing solitude. They became archetypes of endurance. In a corner cafe in Vienna, a young historian types the last lines of her dissertation. It's about Cece, of course. They all write about Cece. She pauses, sips her coffee, and stares at the photograph pinned to her notes. A blur of movement caught in late 19th century film, the Empress's veil lifted just enough to show a half-smile. The historian wonders what she was thinking in that instant, the woman who hated being seen but left behind enough portraits to fill a cathedral. She writes one last sentence. Freedom, for her, was not flight, but the right to vanish without explanation. Then she closes her laptop, leaves a few coins by the saucer, and steps into the same streets where the Empress once walked, feeling a thread of connection humming under the pavement. Across the sea in London, the Victoria and Albert Museum hosts a new exhibition, Women Who Wore Crowns. The crowd shuffles from portrait to portrait, Isabella, Marie Antoinette, Maria Stuart, Cece, Louisa, guided by placards describing grace under scrutiny and duty under pressure. But near the end of the exhibit, in a dim alcove where the air feels heavier, there's a small display case with something humbler inside, a handwritten page from Victoria's journal, ink faded to sepia. The words read, "It is not power that weighs upon me, but remembrance. I am the keeper of too many yesterdays." People stop, read, fall silent. A few take photos, one woman doesn't. She just stands there a long while, then whispers, "I know what you mean." And in that instant, the glass between centuries dissolves a little. Meanwhile in Lisbon, the Basilica da Estrela glows with candlelight again. It's late spring, the anniversary of Maria II's death. The choir gathers as they have for more than 100 years. Men, women, children, none of them royal, all of them faithful to a tradition no one remembers starting. The organ hums its low first note, and the hymn unfurls into the rafters, slow and gentle. If you listen closely, you can hear her voice braided through it, a soprano line that rises and fades, the same timbre as the breeze moving through the high windows. It's the sound of a woman who tried to hold a country together with her bare hands and kindness alone. Outside, Lisbon sparkles like scattered coins on the dark river. The trams creak uphill, lovers linger on balconies, and somewhere an old bell rings for evening mass. The city has forgiven her, the world has, maybe even she has. Everywhere you look, the remnants of those lost queens hide in plain sight. The old velvet curtains of Versailles now hang in museums, their fabric frayed where sunlight touched too often. Children press their noses to the glass, pointing at Marie Antoinette's silver shoe, no bigger than a bird. In Madrid, Isabella's portrait hangs crooked in a minor gallery, her painted eyes still sparkling with something that feels like mischief. A janitor, dusting nearby, mutters. She looks like she's about to say something scandalous, and smiles to himself. In Copenhagen, an archivist finds another letter of Lovisa's tucked in a hymnal. It's short. I have learned that quiet is a kind of courage. And in Belgium, an old groom keeps tending the stables near Spa, even though no one rides there anymore. For the Duchess, he says, simply, brushing the mane of a ghost horse that has long since vanished. Historians keep arguing about the usual things, politics, legacy, influence, but the truth has already slipped past them, hiding in these smaller, tenderer moments. The Queen's real legacy was never about empire. It was about how to survive within the cage and still find beauty inside the bars. They taught a continent how to endure heartbreak with elegance, how to turn silence into dignity, how to lose everything and remain themselves. And when the world stopped bowing to them, it began learning from them. Now, when a woman walks alone through a storm, unafraid, when she refuses to be told that duty is a substitute for desire, when she laughs too loudly, rides too fast, loves too freely, she carries something of them with her. The crowns are gone. The spirit remains. You stand again at the edge of the story, listening. The sound is softer now. No trumpets, no bells, no fanfare. Just wind and the distant ticking of unseen clocks. The world has moved on, but its pulse still beats in the same quiet rhythm those queens once knew. And somewhere, perhaps in the hush of an old chapel, perhaps in the reflection of a museum case, you hear them whisper one last truth. We were lonely, but we left the door open for you. You linger in that whisper. We left the door open for you. And it carries you forward again, through corridors of time that feel less like history and more like memory you didn't know you owned. The door they left isn't gilded or guarded. It's small, unassuming, the sort of doorway you might miss if you're not paying attention. Yet when you step through, the air feels different, quieter, kinder, full of the faint perfume of roses pressed between pages. Beyond it lies the modern world. Trains hum beneath cities. Glass towers stretch where palaces once ruled the skyline. But beneath all that steel, the rhythm of the old stories still beats, soft and stubborn, in the hearts of those who've inherited their silence. Because the queens may be gone, but the patterns they carved into the world remain, traces of them folded into how we love, how we grieve, how we persist. In Edinburgh, it's raining again. It always is. A group of schoolchildren tours Holyrood Palace, their sneakers squeaking against the waxed floors. Their teacher points toward a glass case where Mary Stuart's embroidery hangs, a faded square of linen, threads frayed but still bright enough to see the thistle and crown she stitched during her captivity. The guide explains its symbolism, the coded defiance hidden in each flower. The children nod politely, but one girl standing apart looks longer. She isn't thinking about monarchy or history. She's thinking about the fact that someone once sat in a cell, hands shaking, heart racing, and still made something beautiful. When they leave, she lingers for one more look. She whispers something, maybe thank you, before running to catch up. That's how the queens survive now, in moments like that. Not in textbooks, but in the quiet recognitions of ordinary lives. In Madrid, an artist paints a new series for an exhibition called Las Olvidadas, the Forgotten Women. Each canvas is a reimagined portrait of a queen stripped of her crown, her formal pose replaced with small, human gestures. Isabella biting her thumbnail, Louisa looking out a window, Marie Antoinette braiding her own hair. The critics call it provocative. The artist calls it repair. When asked why she chose these women, she answers, because they were allowed everything except to feel. The opening night is crowded. People murmur before the paintings, confused by the intimacy of them. One old woman wipes her eyes and says, "They look like my daughters." And for the first time in centuries, the queens are seen not as relics but as relatives. Far north, in Copenhagen, the sea fog rolls over the city like an exhale. The old palace where Lovisa once lived is quiet now, its rooms part museum, part memory. The curators keep one corner untouched, her writing desk, her spectacles, a tiny porcelain cup with a chip on the rim. Visitors pass by it quickly. There are more glamorous things to see. But one afternoon, a Danish poet stands there for an hour, scribbling notes in a worn notebook. A week later, she posts a new poem titled The Letter She Never Sent. It ends like this. She said nothing for 40 years, and the silence still glows. It goes viral. The palace gets more visitors that month than it has in a decade. Meanwhile, in a cafe overlooking the Danube, a musician plays an old waltz she found in a Viennese archive, unsigned, but believed to have been composed by Cece herself. It's fragile, unfinished, just a few bars of melody that drift and vanish. The musician loops it on a synthesizer, layering it with heartbeat percussion and soft strings. She calls the piece Freedom in D minor. When she performs it live, the audience doesn't move. The song feels like memory itself, learning how to breathe again. And for those 3 minutes, the empress who fled every room she ever entered finally fills one. In London, a young filmmaker screens her documentary, The Quiet Monarchs. It isn't about their politics, it's about their loneliness. Archival footage, diary entries, letters read aloud by modern women. Over the closing credits, she uses Victoria's own words. The heart does not age, it only folds upon itself. The film wins awards, but what matters more are the letters that start arriving afterward, from nurses, teachers, mothers, widows, all saying the same thing in different ways. I saw myself in them. It's strange, isn't it? How these women who spent their lives isolated from their people have finally become the most relatable of all. They lived in cages, yes, but the bars were made of expectations, and we still know those bars. They learned to smile through grief, to make beauty from duty, to hold still until the world turned softer. That's the inheritance they left, the art of stillness without surrender. Historians will continue to debate their failures, their power, their contradictions. But history never belonged entirely to historians. It belongs to those who carry its weight without realizing it. The way you breathe through a hard day, the way you keep going when no one thanks you, the way you refuse to vanish even when you're unseen. Those are royal acts too. The door they left open isn't for courtiers or chroniclers, it's for you, for anyone who's ever felt like a stranger in their own story. If you step through it now, you'll find the queens waiting, not in marble, but in the small miracles of endurance that outlast every crown. They don't need your pity, they're beyond that, but they would be pleased to know you're still listening. The air shifts. Somewhere far away a harp string hums, a single, delicate note, neither mournful nor triumphant, just steady. You take a breath, the queens fade. The door closes softly behind them, and what remains is not their loneliness at all, it's their courage. The harp string fades, but the resonance lingers like something unseen brushing against your ribs, a vibration that isn't sound but memory. The air feels different now, lighter somehow, as though all that grief has been sifted into dust too fine to carry. You are back in the present, the age of screens and speed, of voices echoing endlessly through fiber optic cables instead of marble corridors. The world is unrecognizable, yet you can still sense them here, their silhouettes folded into modern reflections, their patterns repeating quietly in the lives of people who have never worn a crown and never will, because loneliness, power, and endurance are older than any throne. They are simply human. In a small apartment in Marseille, a single mother sits at her kitchen table at 1 a.m. Her daughter's drawings cover the fridge. Unpaid bills line the counter. She scrolls through her phone, too tired to sleep. A headline catches her eye. The Lost Diaries of Queen Isabella II. Out of boredom, she reads. She learns about the girl who was queen at 3, who prayed between spoonfuls of chocolate, who once whispered to her canary, Libertad. She reads about the laughter, the scandals, the forced smiles, and something inside her softens. She closes the article, stares at the dark window, and whispers to her reflection, "You did your best." Then she goes to bed, feeling a little less unseen. In a subway tunnel under Tokyo, a violinist busks between trains. The melody is haunting and sweet, something between a lullaby and an elegy. When people drop coins in her case, she nods, but keeps playing. The tune is her own arrangement of that fragment once attributed to Cece, Freedom in D minor. She doesn't know the story behind it, she just likes how it sounds like rain on metal. Yet somehow the notes find their way back to where they began. Another lonely woman's search for peace. In a library in Lisbon, a student writing a paper on 19th century feminism pauses at a quote by Queen Maria II. Delicacy is what they call women they plan to ignore. The student smiles, underlines it twice, and writes in the margin, "Still true." Later that night, she prints the line in bold and tapes it above her desk. It stays there for years. In a quiet corner of a Copenhagen park, a gardener tends a bed of white lilies planted in honor of Queen Lovisa. Tourists barely glance at the plaque, but he does. Every spring, when the first bloom opens, he kneels to brush the petals clean of rain and murmurs, "For her." He doesn't know why he says it. He just does. Across the Atlantic, a group of teenagers sits in a museum workshop, surrounded by fragments of restored textiles. Their instructor passes around a square of fabric, a replica of Mary Stuart's embroidery. They touch it carefully, tracing the stitched thistle and crown. "Imagine," the instructor says, "having nothing left to give the world but patience." One of the girls, purple hair, chipped black nail polish, nods. "That's metal," she says softly. The others laugh, but they all understand. The centuries dissolve, the stories of queens become stories of everyone. What was once divine becomes domestic, and what was once tragic becomes a kind of quiet instruction. You start to see it everywhere. The nurse who hums to calm her patient before surgery, Marie Antoinette's instinct for grace under pressure. The woman who keeps walking after losing everything, Victoria's endurance, reborn without the lace. The artist who paints in secret because she can't stop. Cece's rebellion translated into color. The daughter who forgives a parent who never learned how to love her, Levisa's mercy, finding a new life. The crowns are gone, the courage remains, and maybe that's the lesson they were trying to leave behind all along. That loneliness is not weakness, that grace is not submission. That the truest kind of power is the ability to keep choosing tenderness in a world that keeps asking for spectacle. Historians will continue to measure their worth in laws, alliances, and wars, but the real inheritance is quieter, the way people still find beauty in restraint, still believe dignity can coexist with vulnerability. In that sense, every small act of kindness, every defiant gesture of gentleness, every silent refusal to be erased is an echo of them, a continuation of their rebellion. Outside, the night thickens. The city hums like a machine dreaming of dawn. Somewhere the wind brushes past a cracked statue of a queen whose name the pigeons no longer care to remember. Yet as the moonlight hits her face for an instant, she looks alive again. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the heartbeat of every woman who ever wore a crown or ever carried one invisibly, thudding beneath the world's noise. Soft, steady, eternal. The heartbeat continues, low, steady, unstoppable, like a thread of music weaving through the noise of modern life. It vibrates beneath the subway rumble, beneath the factory hum, beneath the chatter of 1,000 unseen lives. The song of the queens hasn't ended, it's just changed key. The old empires are gone, but the feeling they carried, the aching weight of expectation, remains, wearing new clothes. The world calls it success, productivity, image. The names change, the pressure doesn't. And sometimes, when a woman looks in the mirror before work and whispers, "Smile," she's not rehearsing for a meeting, she's performing a ritual older than history itself. Because the performance began centuries ago, in ballrooms and council chambers, under candlelight and scrutiny, and the daughters of those women have simply inherited the stage. A professor in Berlin gives a lecture titled "The Architecture of Solitude." She talks about castles as metaphors, how their thick walls were both fortress and prison, how windows were designed not for escape, but for display. She projects images of Windsor, Schönbrunn, Versailles, and Pena, tracing the geometry of power that doubled as containment. Then she pauses, looks at her students, and says softly, "Every queen had a window that looked outward but never opened." The room is silent. She smiles faintly. We all have one. In an old theatre in Paris, a dancer performs a solo piece called La Dernière Reine, the Last Queen. There's no music, only the scrape of her shoes on the stage. Her costume is simple, a white shift, a paper crown. She begins upright, composed, regal. Slowly she bends, curls, sheds the crown piece by piece until she's barefoot, breathless, human. When the lights fade, she whispers to the audience, "I am still here." The applause sounds like rain. At a London cafe near Kensington, a young couple argues quietly over coffee. She says, "You never listen?" He sighs, "You always talk in riddles." The conversation stalls. At the next table, an old woman, elegant in a worn grey coat, leans over and says gently, "If you want to stay in love, don't keep score." They both blink at her. She smiles, wraps her scarf tighter, and adds, "Victoria said that once. The Queen, I mean. I read it somewhere." Then she leaves, and the couple sits in stunned silence, unsure if it was advice or apparition. In a workshop in Mexico City, a costume designer sews a replica of Marie Antoinette's dress, not the lavish kind, but the simple muslin gown the Queen wore in her final days. The designer runs her hands along the fabric, muttering, "She deserved softness." She isn't making it for a film, but for herself. To wear during performances she hasn't yet written, to remind herself that gentleness can be armor. She finishes the last seam at sunrise and hangs the gown in the window. Outside, the city glows gold. And in Lisbon, a grandmother tells her granddaughter a bedtime story, not about princesses who marry kings, but about a little girl who grew up to be queen because no one else would dare. The child interrupts. Was she happy? The grandmother smiles, tucks the blanket under her chin. Sometimes, she says. But she was brave every day. Even when she was scared. Especially then. The stories keep unfolding, bending, evolving. They travel farther than palaces ever could, through songs, books, films, conversations whispered over tea. What was once tragedy has become inheritance. Historians might argue that Europe's youngest queens were doomed by history, that their power was never their own. But you can see it differently now. Maybe the miracle wasn't that they ruled kingdoms. Maybe it's that they kept something alive inside themselves that kingdoms could never rule, the will to keep loving the world even when it misunderstood them. In the Museum of Schönbrunn, the final gallery is nearly empty. At the far wall hangs a new exhibit, a mirror framed in dark walnut, positioned beside a single placard that reads, "Stand here, you are the continuation." Visitors step up, peer into the glass, see only themselves, and the faint shimmer of chandeliers behind them. Some laugh, embarrassed. Others stare longer. One woman wipes a tear she can't explain. Maybe that's what the queens wanted all along. Not worship, but recognition. To know that someday someone would look through the centuries and whisper, "I understand." Outside, the evening cools. A church bell rings across Vienna, answering another in Lisbon, another in London. The sound drifts upward, folding into clouds, into wind, into something wordless. The past exhales, and for the first time you realize that this story, their story, was never really about crowns at all. It was about endurance, about the stubborn, shining humanity that refused to vanish even when dressed in gold. You close your eyes and hear them again. 30 voices, soft as breath, murmuring together. We were born into silence. We made it sing. There's a hush before the last turning of the page, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full. Full of the footsteps you've followed across centuries. Full of the sighs, the laughter, the small defiant gestures that made survival feel like art. You've met them all. Isabella, Victoria, Marie, Maria, Mary, Cece, Lavisa, and the rest, and they've left their fingerprints all over you. Now you carry them quietly, the way the ocean carries salt, unseen but ever present. And in this final stretch, history slows. The candles burn lower, the voices of the past fade to a murmur. Only one thing remains, the sound of your own breath echoing theirs. You find yourself in a corridor without walls, part museum, part dream. The air smells faintly of linen and lavender, like pages that have just been closed. Along the way are 30 mirrors, each holding a reflection that isn't quite your own. One shows Isabella's porcelain steadiness, another Victoria's iron composure, another still Cece's restless light. When you move, they move until all the faces overlap and blur into a single one, yours. There's no music now, just the whisper of fabric, as if every dress they ever wore has gathered into one long breath. In front of you stands a chair, the last throne, though it looks nothing like a throne. It's a simple wooden seat, polished by centuries of waiting. You sit. The wood is warm, the silence expands, and from somewhere, above, behind, within, you hear them again, the chorus of all those lonely hearts. We were never asking to be worshipped. We were asking to be believed. You nod because you finally do. Outside this imagined corridor, the world keeps moving, cars, laughter, the quiet rustle of someone closing a shop for the night. None of it feels separate anymore. The story has melted back into life, where it belongs. You walk through a city that could be any city, light reflecting off puddles, music leaking from an open window, a child tugging their mother's hand. No palaces, no crowns, just ordinary endurance, the kind that has always been the truest kind of royalty. For a moment you stop beneath a street lamp. The glass above you glows like a halo, and you think of Victoria's prayer, Cece's poems, Mary's embroidery. You realize that the thread running through all of it was never sorrow. It was persistence, the courage to wake up again, the courage to keep loving the world, even when it doesn't notice. That's what the lonely hearts of Europe's youngest queens were teaching all along. The wind shifts. A bell rings somewhere far away, thin and sweet. The night folds around it like velvet. If you close your eyes, you can feel their presence not as ghosts, but as rhythm. The steady, generous pulse that connects everything that ever survived. It beats once for each of them, and then once for you. And then the sound stretches into quiet. The peaceful, eternal kind of quiet they never had enough of. Sleep settles over the story like a blessing. Rest now, they whisper. You are seen, you are enough. The lamps dim, the mirrors fade, the corridor dissolves into the dark. And in that soft, endless dark, the final words arrive, not shouted, not carved, but breathed. We were lonely, yes, but we made the loneliness beautiful.